The collapse of Roman authority in Britain around 410 AD left behind a power vacuum that fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of what would eventually become Scotland. As the legions withdrew southward and the Hadrian's wall frontier crumbled into irrelevance, the territories north of the Fourth Clyde Line emerged as a complex mosaic of competing peoples, each with distinct cultural identities, languages, and territorial ambitions. This period witnessed the emergence of four primary groups that would dominate Scottish affairs for the next 4 centuries. The Picts, who controlled the vast territories from the Highlands down to the Forth, the Gaels of Dalriada, who had established themselves along the western seaboard and islands, the Britons, who maintained their hold over much of southern Scotland, and the Anglo-Saxons, who pressed northward from their expanding kingdoms in Northumbria. The Picts represented perhaps the most enigmatic yet powerful force in early medieval Scotland. Their kingdom, or more accurately kingdoms, stretched across an enormous territory encompassing modern-day Highland Scotland, the northeastern coastlands, and much of the area between the Great Glen and the River Forth. Archaeological evidence suggests the Picts maintained sophisticated political structures, with major centres at places like Burghead in Moray, where massive fortifications protected what appears to have been a significant royal stronghold. The famous Pictish symbol stones scattered across their territory provide tantalising glimpses into their complex society. These carved monuments, featuring intricate depictions of animals, geometric patterns, and mysterious symbols, likely served multiple functions as territorial markers, commemorative monuments, and expressions of political authority. Pictish society operated under a unique matrilineal succession system that would prove crucial to later political developments. Unlike their neighbours, who typically followed patrilineal inheritance patterns, the Picts traced royal succession through the female line. This system meant that kingship often passed not from father to son, but to the sons of royal sisters or to men who married into the royal bloodline. The implications of this practice extended far beyond mere ceremonial protocol, creating a political environment where marriage alliances carried extraordinary strategic importance, and where succession disputes could fracture the kingdom along complex genealogical lines. The Pictish military machine proved formidable in defending their extensive territories. Contemporary accounts describe Pictish warriors as fierce fighters who employed both traditional Celtic warfare tactics and innovative strategies adapted to their challenging terrain. They constructed extensive networks of hill forts and coastal fortifications, many of which show evidence of sophisticated engineering techniques, including vitrified stone construction, where intense fires were used to fuse stone ramparts into nearly impregnable barriers. The Picts also maintained a powerful naval capability, essential for controlling their scattered island territories and coastal settlements. West of the Pictish domains, the Kingdom of Dalriada represented a fundamentally different political and cultural entity. Founded by Gaelic-speaking settlers from Ireland, traditionally dated to around 500 AD under the leadership of Fergus Mór MacEirc, Dalriada occupied the Western Highlands, the islands of the Inner Hebrides, and portions of what is now Argyll. The kingdom's geography dictated its character, a maritime realm connected by sea routes rather than overland communications, where longboats served as the primary means of transportation and naval power determined political influence. Dalriadan society reflected its Irish origins while adapting to Scottish conditions. The kingdom was organised around several major kindreds or canella, each controlling specific territories and maintaining their own military forces. The Cenel Gabraean dominated the Kintyre Peninsula and held the royal centre at Dunad, a spectacular hilltop fortress whose stone-carved footprint and boar symbol still survive as testament to royal inauguration ceremonies. The Cenel Owain controlled much of northern Argyll and the islands, while the Cenel Oengusa held territories in Islay and surrounding areas. This decentralised structure provided flexibility, but also created internal tensions that would periodically erupt into civil warfare. The strategic location of Dalriada, controlling sea routes between Ireland and northern Britain, made it a crucial player in wider Celtic politics. Dalriadan kings maintained close connections with their Irish cousins, often intervening in Ulster politics or calling upon Irish allies during conflicts with their Scottish neighbours. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dunad reveals extensive trade networks stretching from Ireland to the Mediterranean, with imported pottery, jewellery and luxury goods demonstrating the kingdom's integration into broader European commerce. South of both Pictish and Dalriadan territories, the Britons maintained several kingdoms that represented the continuation of Romano-British political traditions. The Kingdom of Alclut, centred on the great fortress of Dumbarton Rock, controlled the lower Clyde Valley and much of southwestern Scotland. This dramatic volcanic outcrop, rising sheer from the River Clyde, provided an almost impregnable stronghold that commanded river traffic and overland routes between the Highlands and the southern lowlands. The Britons of Alclut spoke a P-Celtic language closely related to Welsh and Cornish, and maintained cultural and political connections with their kinsmen in Wales and Cornwall. Further east, the Kingdom of Rhaeged encompassed territories stretching from the Solway Firth northward into the Scottish borders. Though much of Rhaeged would eventually fall to Anglo-Saxon expansion, its northern portions remained under British control throughout this period. These British kingdoms preserved many aspects of late Roman administrative practices, including a degree of urban continuity and sophisticated legal systems that distinguished them from their more traditionally Celtic neighbours. The fourth major player in early medieval Scottish politics was the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria, which had emerged from the fusion of the earlier kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira. Under aggressive rulers like Aethelfrith and later Oswald, Northumbrian forces pushed steadily northward, capturing the British stronghold of Edinburgh around 638 and establishing a permanent presence in southeastern Scotland. The Northumbrians brought with them not only military pressure but also new cultural influences, including their own form of Christianity and administrative practices derived from Anglo-Saxon England. The Northumbrian advance represented more than mere territorial expansion. It constituted a fundamental challenge to the existing Celtic political order. Unlike the other kingdoms, which operated within broadly similar cultural frameworks despite their differences, Northumbria represented an alien political system with different concepts of kingship, law, and social organisation. The kingdom's expansion created a permanent source of tension that would influence Scottish politics for centuries. Into this complex political landscape came Christianity, arriving through multiple channels and profoundly transforming the spiritual and cultural life of early Scotland. The traditional narrative emphasises the role of St. Columba, the Irish monk who established the monastery of Iona around 563 AD. But the reality of Christian conversion proved far more complex and gradual than this single missionary journey might suggest. St. Ninian had already begun Christian missionary work among the southern Picts and Britons in the late 4th or early 5th century, establishing his monastery at Whithorn in Galloway. Archaeological evidence from Whithorn reveals a thriving Christian community that maintained connections with Christian centres across Britain and Ireland. The famous Latina stone, dating to around 450 AD, provides one of the earliest Christian inscriptions in Scotland, demonstrating that organised Christian communities existed well before Columba's arrival. Columba's mission to Iona, however, represented a watershed moment in Scottish Christian history. The monastery he established on this small Hebridean island became one of the most influential religious centres in medieval Europe. Iona's strategic location, accessible by sea from Ireland, Dalriada and the Pictish territories, made it an ideal base for missionary activities. The monastery's scriptorium produced magnificent illuminated manuscripts, including possibly the Book of Kells, while its school attracted students from across the Celtic world. The spread of Christianity from Iona followed established political and kinship networks. Columba's royal connections within Dalriada provided crucial support for his missionary activities, while his diplomatic skills enabled him to establish relationships with Pictish rulers. The conversion of the Pictish king Bridai mac Maelchon, probably occurring in the 560s, opened vast territories to Christian influence and established precedents for the close relationship between church and state that would characterise medieval Scotland. Christian monasteries quickly became far more than religious centres. They evolved into crucial nodes of learning, economic activity and political influence. Monasteries like Iona, Whithorn, and later foundations at places like Abernethy and St Andrews accumulated vast landholdings, maintained schools and libraries, and served as diplomatic meeting places for secular rulers. The monks themselves often came from noble families, creating networks that bridged religious and secular authority. The introduction of literacy through Christian education had profound political implications. Written records, legal documents, and diplomatic correspondence became increasingly important tools of governance, giving literate rulers and their clerical advisors significant advantages over their illiterate competitors. The Church also provided a new model of institutional continuity that transcended individual lifespans, offering stability in a world otherwise dominated by personal relationships and temporary alliances. Warfare remained a constant feature of early medieval Scottish politics, but the nature and scale of conflict evolved significantly during this period. Traditional cattle raiding and small-scale territorial disputes continued, but the emergence of more centralised kingdoms enabled larger military campaigns with broader strategic objectives. The Picts and Dalriadans fought repeatedly over territorial boundaries and tribute arrangements, with major battles occurring at places like Glen Mama in 719 and Dunachon in 685. The Battle of Dunachon deserves particular attention as it fundamentally altered the balance of power in northern Britain. In 685, the Northumbrian king Ecgfrith launched a major invasion of Pictish territory, probably seeking to establish permanent control over the wealthy lands north of the Forth. The Pictish king Bridai mac Billy drew the Northumbrian army deep into Pictish territory before turning to fight at a location near modern-day Dunachon in Angus. The battle resulted in a catastrophic Northumbrian defeat, with King Ecgfrith killed along with much of his army. This victory effectively ended Northumbrian expansion northward and established Pictish dominance over much of eastern Scotland. The political relationships between these various kingdoms operated through complex webs of kinship, marriage alliance, tribute arrangements, and personal loyalty that defied simple categorization. Kings regularly took hostages from rival courts, both as insurance against betrayal and as means of creating cross-cultural connections. Marriage alliances linked royal families across ethnic and linguistic boundaries, creating situations where the same individual might have legitimate claims to thrones in multiple kingdoms. These interconnections facilitated cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Pictish artists incorporated Irish motifs into their sculpture, while Gaelic place names spread into traditionally Pictish territories. The Britons adopted certain Irish legal practices, and Anglo-Saxon influence appeared in the material culture of all the other kingdoms. Languages began to merge and influence each other, with Gaelic gradually spreading eastward into Pictish territories while Pictish loanwords entered Gaelic vocabulary. The process of cultural exchange accelerated during the 8th century as political relationships became increasingly intertwined. Pictish kings began adopting Gaelic names, while Dalriadan rulers sometimes claimed Pictish royal titles. Intermarriage between royal families created individuals with complex ethnic identities that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. These developments laid crucial groundwork for the eventual political unification that would transform Scotland in the 9th century. Religious developments paralleled and reinforced these political changes. The Celtic Church, despite regional variations, provided a common institutional framework that operated across political boundaries. Monasteries served as neutral meeting places where rulers from different kingdoms could negotiate without loss of face, while clerical networks facilitated diplomatic communication and cultural exchange. The gradual adoption of similar Christian practices and beliefs created shared cultural references that helped bridge traditional ethnic divisions. The political landscape that emerged from centuries of fragmented Celtic kingdoms reached a critical juncture in the mid-9th century when a single remarkable figure seized an opportunity that would fundamentally reshape Scottish history. Kenneth MacAlpin, known in Gaelic as Sinead MacAilpin, represented the convergence of bloodlines and political circumstances that made possible what had previously seemed impossible: the unification of the Picts and Scots into a single kingdom that would become known as Alba. Kenneth's path to power reflected the complex web of kinship relationships that had developed between the major Scottish kingdoms over previous centuries. Born into the Dalriadan royal house of Keniln-Gabrain around 810, he inherited legitimate claims to the Dalriadan throne through his father Alpin, who had ruled briefly before his death in battle against the Picts around 834. However, Kenneth's most crucial inheritance came through his mother's line, which connected him to Pictish royalty through the matrilineal succession system that governed Pictish kingship. This dual heritage positioned him uniquely to bridge the divide between the two most powerful kingdoms north of the Fourth Clyde line. The opportunity for unification arose from a combination of external pressure and internal instability that weakened both kingdoms simultaneously. Viking raids had intensified dramatically during the early 9th century, with Norse longships penetrating deep into Scottish waters and establishing permanent bases in the northern and western isles. These attacks disrupted traditional trade routes, destroyed coastal settlements, and forced both Pictish and Dalriadan rulers to divert resources from territorial expansion to defensive measures. The Vikings proved particularly devastating to Dalriada, whose scattered island territories and sea-dependent economy made it especially vulnerable to naval assault. Simultaneously, both kingdoms faced severe succession crises that fractured their internal stability. The Pictish kingdom had endured a series of short-lived reigns and contested successions that weakened central authority and encouraged regional nobles to pursue independent policies. Archaeological evidence from major Pictish centres like Burghead and Rhynie suggests significant disruption during this period, with some fortifications showing signs of violent destruction that may indicate internal warfare rather than external attack. Dalriada faced equally severe challenges, with the kingdom effectively fragmenting into competing territories controlled by different branches of the royal kindreds. The traditional power centre at Dunad appears to have been abandoned during this period, with political authority dispersing among various strongholds throughout Argyll and the islands. This fragmentation left individual Dalriadan territories exposed to both Viking attacks and Pictish expansion, creating desperate circumstances that demanded radical solutions. Kenneth MacAlpin moved decisively to exploit these circumstances, launching his bid for power around 843. Rather than attempting to conquer the Pictish kingdom through military force alone, he pursued a sophisticated strategy that combined legitimate dynastic claims with political alliance building and strategic marriages. His Pictish royal connections, probably through his mother's family, provided the legal foundation for his claims, while his established position within Dalriada gave him the military resources necessary to press those claims effectively. The process of unification proved neither immediate nor unopposed. Kenneth faced resistance from Pictish nobles, who viewed his Dalriadan origins with suspicion, as well as from rival claimants within both kingdoms who possessed their own legitimate hereditary rights. Contemporary sources, though fragmentary, suggest that Kenneth's consolidation of power required several years of careful manoeuvring, strategic compromises, and occasional military action against recalcitrant opponents. Archaeological evidence provides crucial insights into the methods Kenneth employed to secure his position. Excavations at key sites throughout former Pictish territory reveal deliberate attempts to blend Pictish and Dalriadan cultural symbols and practices. New stone sculptures commissioned during Kenneth's reign incorporated traditional Pictish artistic motifs alongside Gaelic inscriptions and Christian symbolism, creating visual statements of unified authority that spoke to both ethnic communities. These monuments served practical political purposes, asserting Kenneth's legitimacy while demonstrating respect for established Pictish traditions. The establishment of the new kingdom required fundamental administrative innovations that could accommodate the diverse populations and territories now under unified rule. Kenneth and his successors developed a flexible system that preserved many existing local structures while imposing overarching royal authority. Pictish nobles who submitted to the new regime retained their lands and local influence, but were gradually integrated into a court structure that blended Dalriadan and Pictish practices. This approach avoided the massive displacement and resistance that might have resulted from more heavy-handed conquest. Marriage alliances played a crucial role in cementing the unification. Kenneth systematically arranged marriages between members of his extended family and prominent Pictish noble houses, creating kinship networks that bound former enemies into the new political structure. These alliances extended beyond mere diplomatic convenience, establishing genuine shared interests between previously separate communities. Children born from these unions possessed unquestionable claims to inheritance in both traditions, creating a new generation of nobles whose very existence embodied the unified kingdom. The linguistic implications of unification proved particularly significant for long-term cultural development. While Pictish remained widely spoken throughout the former Pictish territories, Gaelic gradually assumed prominence as the language of royal administration and high culture. This shift occurred not through forced imposition, but through the practical advantages that Gaelic offered as the language of the ruling dynasty and the expanding church hierarchy. Pictish place names survived in large numbers, preserving geographical knowledge and local traditions, but new settlements and administrative centres typically received Gaelic names that reflected the changing political reality. Religious institutions provided essential support for the unification process. The Celtic Church, with its network of monasteries and clerical connections spanning both former kingdoms, offered a ready-made institutional framework for unified administration. Kenneth and his successors patronised existing religious foundations while establishing new monasteries that served both spiritual and political functions. These institutions provided education, maintained records, and served as meeting places where nobles from different backgrounds could interact within a neutral sacred environment. The external threat posed by Viking expansion actually strengthened Kenneth's position by providing a compelling justification for unification. Separate Pictish and Dalriadan kingdoms had proven inadequate to resist Norse pressure, but a unified kingdom could marshal significantly greater resources for defence. Kenneth's military innovations reflected this new strategic reality, combining traditional Celtic warfare techniques with adaptations designed specifically to counter Viking tactics. Viking raids during this period followed predictable patterns that allowed defensive preparation. Norse forces typically arrived in fleets of longships during the summer campaigning season, targeting coastal settlements and river valleys that offered easy access to the interior. The raiders sought portable wealth, slaves, and strategic positions that could serve as bases for further expansion. Their superior naval mobility and disciplined fighting formations gave them significant advantages over traditional Celtic military forces, but these advantages could be countered through appropriate defensive strategies. Kenneth's military reforms addressed these challenges through several innovations. He established a network of coastal watchtowers and signal stations that could provide early warning of approaching Viking fleets. These installations, built at strategic points along the coastline and on prominent hills, enabled rapid communication across vast distances and allowed defensive forces to concentrate at threatened locations before raiders could establish secure beachheads. The unified kingdom also developed new military tactics specifically designed to exploit Viking weaknesses. While Norse forces excelled in initial assaults and organised retreats to their ships, they proved vulnerable to sustained pressure that prevented their return to secure bases. Kenneth's forces learned to use Scotland's challenging terrain to their advantage, employing guerrilla tactics that harassed Viking columns while avoiding direct confrontation with superior Norse formations. These strategies proved particularly effective in the Highlands, where narrow passes and dense forests negated Viking advantages in open battle. Naval warfare presented particular challenges for the newly unified kingdom. The Vikings possessed superior shipbuilding technology and centuries of maritime experience that gave them overwhelming advantages in direct naval confrontation. Kenneth's response focused on denying the Vikings secure bases rather than challenging their fleets directly. Coastal fortifications were strengthened or relocated to positions that commanded harbour entrances, while local populations received training and equipment for rapid evacuation when Viking attacks proved inevitable. The selection of Scone as the ceremonial centre of the new kingdom reflected careful political calculation rather than mere geographical convenience. Located on the River Tay in the heart of former Pictish territory, Scone possessed strategic advantages that made it an ideal royal centre. The site controlled river traffic along one of Scotland's major waterways, while remaining sufficiently inland to avoid direct Viking naval assault. More importantly, Scone's location demonstrated Kenneth's commitment to ruling from within traditionally Pictish lands, rather than imposing Dalriadan dominance from western strongholds. Archaeological investigations at Scone have revealed evidence of significant construction activity during Kenneth's reign, including the creation of ceremonial spaces designed to accommodate large gatherings of nobles from throughout the kingdom. The famous Stone of Destiny, upon which Scottish kings would be inaugurated for centuries, was probably installed at Scone during this period as part of Kenneth's efforts to create new royal traditions that incorporated elements from both Pictish and Dalriadan practices. The development of royal ceremonial at Scone represented a sophisticated blend of existing traditions adapted to serve the needs of the unified kingdom. Pictish inauguration practices, which emphasised the sacred nature of kingship and the ruler's connection to the land, were combined with Dalriadan concepts of personal loyalty and warrior leadership. The resulting ceremonies created powerful symbolic statements about the nature of royal authority that could appeal to nobles from both traditions, while establishing new precedents for future reigns. The Stone of Destiny itself embodied these symbolic complexities. Geological analysis suggests the stone originated in the Scone area, connecting it to Pictish territory, but its installation as a royal inauguration seat reflected Dalriadan concepts of sacred kingship. The stone's subsequent history, including its eventual removal to Westminster Abbey by Edward IV of England, would make it one of the most potent symbols of Scottish national identity, but its origins lay in Kenneth MacAlpin's efforts to create unifying royal traditions. Royal regalia and symbols of authority developed during Kenneth's reign similarly blended traditions from both kingdoms. The ceremonial weapons, jewellery and other objects used in royal ceremonies incorporated Pictish artistic motifs alongside Gaelic inscriptions and Christian symbolism. These items served practical political purposes, visually representing the unified nature of royal authority, while demonstrating continuity with established traditions that commanded respect from both populations. The administrative structure of the new kingdom required innovations that could accommodate diverse legal traditions, languages, and local customs. Kenneth and his immediate successors developed a flexible system that preserved many existing local practices while imposing overarching royal authority through a network of appointed officials and regional strongholds. This approach avoided the massive disruption that would have resulted from attempting to impose uniform administrative practices across culturally diverse territories. Local law continued to operate much as it had before unification, with traditional assemblies and legal procedures handling most disputes and administrative matters. However, major crimes, territorial disputes, and matters affecting royal interests came under the jurisdiction of royal courts that applied new legal principles designed to serve the unified kingdom. These royal courts provided forums where nobles from different backgrounds could seek justice while demonstrating their loyalty to the new political order. The economic implications of unification proved substantial and largely beneficial for both former kingdoms. The elimination of warfare between Picts and Dalriadans freed resources for economic development and trade expansion. The unified kingdom could offer greater security to merchants and craftsmen, encouraging commercial activity that had been disrupted by constant raiding and territorial disputes. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased trade connections with Ireland, northern England, and continental Europe, suggesting that political stability translated into economic prosperity. Kenneth MacAlpin's death around 858 marked the end of the unification phase, but the kingdom he had created proved remarkably durable. His successors, particularly his brother Donald and later his sons Constantine and Aed, continued the process of consolidation while adapting royal policies to meet evolving challenges. The MacAlpin dynasty would rule Scotland for nearly 2 centuries, establishing precedents and traditions that would influence Scottish kingship long after their direct line ended. The transformation of separate Pictish and Dalriadan identities into a unified Scottish identity occurred gradually over several generations. Intermarriage, shared military campaigns against common enemies, and participation in unified royal ceremonies created new forms of loyalty that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The process was neither uniform nor complete, with regional variations persisting for centuries, but the foundation established by Kenneth MacAlpin proved strong enough to survive numerous challenges and crises. The death of Malcolm II in 1034 marked the end of an era that had seen the MacAlpin dynasty establish Scotland as a unified kingdom capable of withstanding external threats and internal divisions. His successor, Duncan I, inherited a realm that had grown substantially in territorial extent and political sophistication, but the challenges facing the Scottish crown had evolved considerably from those confronted by Kenneth MacAlpin 2 centuries earlier. The kingdom now stretched from the Highlands to the Forth, incorporating diverse populations and territories that required increasingly complex administrative solutions. Duncan's brief and troubled reign, ending with his death in battle against Macbeth in 1040, demonstrated that the fundamental work of consolidating royal authority remained incomplete. Macbeth's 17-year reign represented a period of relative stability and prosperity that has been obscured by later literary interpretations of his rule. Contemporary sources suggest that Macbeth governed effectively, maintaining peace with both England and Norway while strengthening Scotland's internal administration. His pilgrimage to Rome in 1050, where he reportedly distributed money to the poor with exceptional generosity, indicates both personal piety and the kingdom's growing wealth. However, Macbeth's legitimacy remained contested, and his reign ended in 1057 when Malcolm III, Duncan's son, returned from exile in England to reclaim his father's throne. Malcolm III, known to history as Malcolm Canmore or Great Chief, ascended to the Scottish throne in 1058 and would rule for 35 years, fundamentally transforming the character of medieval Scotland through his systematic adoption of Anglo-Saxon governmental practices and his strategic marriage to Margaret of Wessex. Malcolm's long exile at the English court of Edward the Confessor had exposed him to administrative techniques, military innovations, and cultural practices that differed markedly from traditional Scottish approaches to kingship. Upon his return, he brought with him not only English military support, but also a cadre of advisors familiar with Anglo-Saxon legal systems, ecclesiastical practices, and court protocols. The transformation began with Malcolm's military campaigns, which demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his commitment to expanding Scottish territory southward into the fertile lands of Lothian. Between 1061 and 1093, Malcolm launched no fewer than 5 major invasions of northern England, each carefully planned to exploit periods of English weakness while avoiding direct confrontation with superior Anglo-Saxon or Norman forces. These campaigns differed significantly from traditional Celtic raiding, employing coordinated infantry and cavalry formations that reflected Malcolm's understanding of contemporary European military practices. The first major campaign in 1061 targeted the Northumbrian strongholds along the Tweed Valley, where Malcolm's forces systematically captured fortified positions that had long served as bases for English expansion northward. The Siege of Wark-on-Tweed demonstrated Malcolm's adoption of continental siege techniques, with Scottish forces employing mangonels and other mechanical devices to breach stone fortifications. Contemporary chroniclers noted the disciplined behaviour of Malcolm's army, which avoided the indiscriminate pillaging typical of earlier Celtic warfare in favour of targeted military objectives designed to secure permanent territorial gains. Malcolm's second invasion in 1070 coincided with the aftermath of the Norman conquest, when northern England remained in turmoil following William the Conqueror's brutal suppression of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Scottish forces advanced as far south as the River Tees, capturing numerous settlements and forcing the submission of local English nobles who recognised Malcolm's authority rather than face continued warfare. This campaign established Scottish control over much of modern-day Northumberland and demonstrated Malcolm's ability to exploit English political instability for strategic advantage. The most significant of Malcolm's military campaigns occurred in 1079, when Scottish forces penetrated deep into Yorkshire before withdrawing with substantial booty and numerous captives. This expedition revealed the growing sophistication of Scottish military organisation, with coordinated supply lines supporting extended operations far from Scottish territory. The campaign also demonstrated Malcolm's diplomatic skill, as he negotiated temporary truces with local English commanders, while maintaining pressure on the Norman administration to recognise Scottish territorial claims. Malcolm's marriage to Margaret of Wessex in approximately 1070 represented far more than a diplomatic alliance. It constituted a cultural revolution that would reshape Scottish society for centuries. Margaret, sister to Edgar Atheling and descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal house of Wessex, brought to the Scottish court not only impeccable royal bloodlines, but also deep knowledge of continental European governmental practices, ecclesiastical reforms, and courtly culture. Her influence on Malcolm and the Scottish nobility proved transformative, introducing administrative innovations and cultural practices that elevated Scotland's international standing while strengthening royal authority. Margaret's immediate impact appeared in the transformation of the Scottish royal court from a relatively informal Celtic institution into a sophisticated centre of European culture and administration. She introduced elaborate ceremonial protocols that emphasised the sacred nature of kingship while creating hierarchical structures that reinforced royal authority over the nobility. The court began to attract scholars, artists, and clerics from across Europe, transforming Edinburgh Castle into a centre of learning and cultural innovation that rivalled contemporary European royal courts. The Queen's religious reforms proved equally significant, as she systematically worked to align Scottish ecclesiastical practices with those of continental Europe and Rome. Margaret found the Scottish Church dominated by Celtic traditions that differed markedly from Roman Catholic practices in matters of liturgy, clerical celibacy, and ecclesiastical organisation. Working closely with Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, and other continental church leaders, she initiated comprehensive reforms designed to bring Scottish Christianity into conformity with Roman practices. Margaret's ecclesiastical reforms began with the reorganisation of existing Scottish monasteries according to continental European models. The ancient Celtic monasteries, which had operated with considerable independence and maintained distinctive liturgical practices, were gradually transformed into institutions that followed Roman Catholic rules and regulations. New monasteries established during Margaret's reign, including foundations at Dunfermline and elsewhere, were built according to continental architectural plans and staffed by monks trained in Roman Catholic traditions. The introduction of Roman Catholic liturgical practices required careful negotiation with established Scottish clerical hierarchies who viewed these changes with suspicion. Margaret's approach emphasised gradual transformation rather than sudden imposition, working through existing church leaders to implement reforms while respecting local traditions where possible. She sponsored the translation of liturgical texts into Gaelic, ensuring that ordinary Scots could participate in reformed religious practices without abandoning their native language. Margaret's influence extended beyond purely religious matters to encompass broader cultural and social reforms that elevated Scottish court culture to European standards. She introduced new forms of artistic expression, including illuminated manuscripts, metalwork, and architectural decoration that reflected continental European aesthetic principles. The Queen's personal library, which included works by continental European scholars and church fathers, became the foundation for expanded educational opportunities within the royal court. The systematic expansion of Scottish territory southward during Malcolm's reign involved not only military conquest, but also careful diplomatic negotiation designed to secure permanent recognition of Scottish gains. The establishment of the modern Scottish-English border resulted from decades of warfare, negotiation, and strategic compromise that reflected both kingdoms' evolving political circumstances and military capabilities. The key territorial acquisitions occurred in Lothian, the fertile region between the Forth and the Tweed that had long been contested between Scottish and English rulers. Malcolm's military campaigns systematically captured the major fortified centres that controlled this region, including Edinburgh, Roxburgh and Berwick-upon-Tweed. However, military conquest alone could not secure permanent control over territories with established English populations and administrative structures. Malcolm's approach to territorial consolidation involved careful integration of existing English administrative systems with Scottish royal authority. English nobles who submitted to Scottish rule retained their lands and local influence, but were required to acknowledge Malcolm as their overlord and provide military service when required. This policy avoided the massive population displacement and resistance that might have resulted from more heavy-handed conquest while creating genuine Scottish control over strategically important territories. The establishment of Scottish administrative centres throughout Lothian required significant investment in fortification and infrastructure development. Malcolm constructed or strengthened castles at key locations including Edinburgh, Stirling and other strategic points that could serve as bases for royal administration and military operations. These fortifications employed the latest European military architecture, with stone construction and sophisticated defensive features that reflected Malcolm's exposure to continental European military engineering. The diplomatic aspects of border establishment proved equally complex, requiring negotiations with successive English rulers who possessed varying degrees of authority and different strategic priorities. Malcolm's dealings with William the Conqueror involved careful calculation of Norman military capabilities and political objectives, while his later negotiations with William's successors required adaptation to changing English political circumstances. The Treaty of Abernethy in 1072 represented a crucial diplomatic settlement that temporarily resolved the territorial disputes between Scotland and England. Under this agreement, Malcolm acknowledged William the Conqueror as his overlord for his English territories, while retaining effective control over Scottish conquests in Lothian. The treaty also provided for the exchange of hostages, including Malcolm's eldest son Duncan, who would be educated at the Norman court and serve as security for Scottish compliance with the agreement's terms. However, the Treaty of Abernethy proved unstable, as both kingdoms' territorial ambitions exceeded the boundaries established by the agreement. Malcolm's subsequent invasions of northern England in 1079 and 1091 demonstrated his continued commitment to southward expansion, while English military responses revealed Norman determination to limit Scottish territorial gains. These ongoing conflicts established patterns of Anglo-Scottish warfare that would persist for centuries. The development of feudal structures within Scotland during Malcolm's reign represented a fundamental transformation of traditional Celtic social and political organisation. The introduction of feudal relationships, with their emphasis on personal loyalty, military service, and hierarchical land tenure, gradually replaced clan-based governance systems that had dominated Scottish society since the kingdom's foundation. Malcolm's implementation of feudal structures began with the systematic granting of landholdings to nobles who pledged personal loyalty and military service to the crown. These grants, known as feudal charters, established legal relationships that bound recipients to provide specified numbers of armed warriors when required, while acknowledging royal authority over their territories. The system created networks of personal loyalty that strengthened royal power while providing mechanisms for military mobilization that proved superior to traditional Celtic arrangements. The transformation from clan-based to feudal governance occurred gradually over several generations, with traditional kinship relationships coexisting alongside new feudal obligations. Scottish nobles found themselves navigating complex webs of loyalty that included both ancient clan affiliations and new feudal duties to the crown. This dual system created opportunities for political manoeuvring, while establishing royal authority over territories that had previously operated with considerable independence. The introduction of feudal military service revolutionised Scottish warfare capabilities, enabling the mobilisation of larger, better-equipped armies than traditional clan-based systems could provide. Feudal obligations required nobles to maintain specified numbers of armoured cavalry and infantry forces, creating professional military capabilities that could compete with contemporary European armies. These forces proved essential for Malcolm's territorial expansion campaigns and for defending Scottish conquests against English counterattacks. The legal implications of feudalisation extended far beyond military obligations to encompass fundamental changes in property rights, judicial procedures, and administrative practices. Feudal law, with its emphasis on written contracts and formal legal procedures, gradually supplemented traditional Celtic legal systems that relied on oral tradition and customary practices. Royal courts gained jurisdiction over an expanding range of legal matters, while local assemblies retained authority over traditional clan disputes and customary law. The economic consequences of feudalisation proved substantial, as the new system encouraged agricultural development and commercial expansion that increased royal revenues while strengthening the overall Scottish economy. Feudal lords possessed incentives to improve their holdings through agricultural innovation and trade development, as increased productivity directly benefited their own wealth and status. The system also facilitated tax collection and military recruitment, providing the crown with resources necessary for territorial expansion and administrative development. Margaret's cultural reforms extended beyond religious matters to encompass fundamental changes in Scottish social customs, artistic expression, and intellectual life that elevated the kingdom's international reputation while strengthening royal authority. Her influence on Scottish court culture proved particularly significant, as she introduced continental European standards of behaviour, dress, and ceremonial practice that transformed the Scottish nobility's self-perception and international relationships. The Queen's promotion of learning and scholarship created new educational opportunities that attracted students and teachers from across Europe, while developing indigenous Scottish intellectual capabilities. The royal court became a centre of manuscript production, with scribes creating illuminated texts that combined Celtic artistic traditions with continental European stylistic influences. These manuscripts serve both practical administrative purposes and cultural functions, preserving knowledge while demonstrating Scottish participation in broader European intellectual developments. Margaret's architectural patronage resulted in the construction of churches and royal buildings that reflected continental European design principles while incorporating elements suited to Scottish conditions and materials. The reconstruction of Dunfermline Abbey, according to continental European monastic architectural standards, created a model that influenced subsequent Scottish church construction for centuries. Similarly, improvements to Edinburgh Castle and other royal residences introduced architectural features that enhanced both defensive capabilities and ceremonial functions. The gradual replacement of Celtic clan-based governance with centralised royal authority required careful management of traditional power structures while implementing administrative innovations that strengthened royal control over distant territories. Malcolm and Margaret's approach emphasised cooperation with existing noble families rather than their displacement, creating hybrid governmental systems that preserved local influence while establishing overarching royal authority. The development of royal administrative systems during this period involved the creation of new governmental offices and procedures that could manage the kingdom's expanding territories and increasingly complex political relationships. Royal chancellors, stewards, and other administrative officials assumed responsibilities that had previously been handled through informal personal relationships, creating institutional continuity that transcended individual reigns while strengthening royal authority over the nobility. The death of Alexander in 1124 brought to the Scottish throne his younger brother David, whose quarter-century of exile and education in the court of Henry I of England had prepared him for a transformation of Scottish governance that would prove more radical and comprehensive than any previous royal initiative. David the ascended to power with an unprecedented understanding of Anglo-Norman administrative systems, military organisation and economic structures that he had observed firsthand during his years as Earl of Huntingdon. His marriage to Maud de Senlis, daughter of Earl Waltheof of Northumbria, had further deepened his connections to the Anglo-Norman aristocracy while providing him with extensive landholdings in England that served as both a source of revenue and a laboratory for testing governmental innovations before implementing them in Scotland. David's vision for Scotland extended far beyond the gradual cultural changes introduced by his predecessors. He envisioned a comprehensive restructuring of Scottish society along Anglo-Norman lines, involving the systematic introduction of feudal landholding, continental European administrative practices, and economic structures that would integrate Scotland fully into the broader European political and commercial networks. This transformation would require not merely the adoption of foreign practices, but their careful adaptation to Scottish conditions and the management of potential resistance from traditional Scottish nobles who viewed such changes with suspicion. The cornerstone of David's revolutionary programme was the systematic introduction of Anglo-Norman feudalism through carefully planned grants of Scottish lands to Norman knights and administrators who possessed both the military capabilities and administrative experience necessary to implement his vision. Unlike previous Scottish rulers who had occasionally employed foreign advisors or soldiers, David embarked upon a comprehensive colonisation programme that would fundamentally alter the composition of Scottish nobility while creating new power structures that bypassed traditional clan-based authority systems. The selection of Norman recipients for these land grants reflected David's sophisticated understanding of both Scottish political realities and Norman capabilities. He chose men who had demonstrated administrative competence in England or Normandy, while possessing sufficient military resources to defend their new Scottish holdings against potential resistance. Walter Fitz-Alan, who received extensive territories in Renfrewshire and became the first High Steward of Scotland, exemplified the type of Norman noble David sought to attract. Walter brought not only proven administrative skills, but also family connections that linked him to the highest levels of Anglo-Norman society, enhancing Scotland's diplomatic standing while providing David with reliable support for his reform programmes. Robert de Bruce, granted lands in Annandale, represented another crucial element in David's strategy. The de Bruce family possessed extensive military experience and substantial resources that enabled them to establish effective control over their Scottish territories while contributing to the kingdom's overall military capabilities. Their subsequent prominence in Scottish affairs, culminating in Robert the Bruce's eventual claim to the Scottish throne, demonstrated the long-term significance of David's Norman settlement programme. The physical transformation of the Scottish landscape under Norman influence became immediately apparent through the construction of Motte and Bailey castles that served both military and administrative functions. These fortifications, built according to standardised Norman designs, provided secure bases for Norman lords while demonstrating the new political order to Scottish populations. The castles typically featured artificial earthen mounds topped by wooden palisades and towers, surrounded by enclosed courtyards that contained residential buildings, workshops, and storage facilities necessary for local administration. The construction of these Norman castles required significant labour mobilisation and resource allocation that demonstrated the new lord's authority while providing economic opportunities for local Scottish populations. Skilled craftsmen, including carpenters, stonemasons and metalworkers, found employment in castle construction projects that introduced new building techniques and architectural styles to Scotland. The economic impact extended beyond construction to encompass ongoing maintenance, provisioning and garrison requirements that created permanent demand for local goods and services. The establishment of a structured feudal hierarchy required careful attention to the relationships between Norman newcomers and existing Scottish nobles who retained significant local influence and territorial control. David's approach emphasised accommodation rather than displacement, creating hybrid arrangements that preserved traditional Scottish lordships within the broader feudal framework while ensuring ultimate royal authority over all territorial grants. Scottish nobles who accepted the new system retained their lands and local influence, but acknowledged feudal obligations to the crown that included military service, attendance at royal courts, and financial contributions for royal campaigns. The integration of Norman and Scottish nobility occurred through strategic marriage alliances that created kinship networks spanning both communities while establishing shared interests in the success of David's governmental reforms. Norman lords who married into established Scottish families gained local legitimacy and knowledge of Scottish customs, while Scottish nobles who formed alliances with Norman newcomers accessed new military techniques, administrative practices, and commercial opportunities. These marriages produced children whose mixed heritage embodied the cultural synthesis that David sought to achieve throughout his kingdom. The military implications of Norman settlement extended far beyond the construction of individual castles to encompass fundamental changes in Scottish warfare capabilities and strategic doctrine. Norman knights brought with them the latest European military technology, including improved armour, weapons, and cavalry tactics that enhanced Scottish military effectiveness, while requiring corresponding changes in military organisation and training. The introduction of heavy cavalry formations, supported by disciplined infantry units and coordinated siege capabilities, transformed Scottish armies from traditional Celtic warbands into forces capable of competing with contemporary European military powers. The economic foundation supporting this military transformation required systematic development of Scottish agricultural and commercial resources to generate revenues necessary for maintaining professional military forces. Norman lords applied continental European agricultural techniques to their Scottish holdings, introducing new crops, livestock breeds, and farming methods that increased productivity while providing surplus resources for military and administrative purposes. The three-field system of crop rotation, common throughout continental Europe but previously unknown in Scotland, enabled more intensive land use while maintaining soil fertility through systematic fallow periods. David's most visible and economically significant innovation was the systematic establishment of royal burghs that served as centres of commerce, craftsmanship, and international trade, while generating substantial revenues for the crown through taxes, customs duties, and market fees. The creation of these planned commercial centres represented a fundamental departure from traditional Scottish economic organisation, which had been based primarily on subsistence agriculture and local exchange, rather than specialised production and long-distance trade. Edinburgh emerged as the premier example of David's urban development programme, transformed from a military stronghold into a thriving commercial centre that attracted merchants, craftsmen and traders from across Europe. The establishment of Edinburgh as a royal burgh involved careful planning of street layouts, market areas and residential districts designed to accommodate diverse economic activities while facilitating royal administration and tax collection. The burgh received extensive privileges, including the right to hold markets, collect tolls, and regulate trade within specified territorial boundaries, creating incentives for commercial development while ensuring royal control over urban growth. The physical layout of Edinburgh reflected continental European urban planning principles adapted to Scottish conditions and defensive requirements. The main street, stretching from the castle down the ridge toward the abbey at Holyrood, provided the primary commercial axis along which markets, workshops and merchant residences were systematically arranged. Side streets and closes accommodated specialised crafts and residential areas for different social groups, while the castle continued to serve military and administrative functions that required secure communication with the commercial district below. Stirling's development as a royal burgh demonstrated David's strategic understanding of geography and commerce in urban planning. Located at the lowest crossing point of the River Forth, Stirling commanded trade routes between the Highlands and Lowlands while providing access to both eastern and western Scotland. The burgh's establishment involved extensive infrastructure development, including bridge construction, harbour facilities, and road improvements that enhanced its commercial advantages while generating revenues through tolls and customs duties. The creation of Perth as a major commercial centre reflected David's recognition of the Tay Valley's agricultural and commercial potential. Perth's location provided access to rich agricultural regions, while enabling river transport that connected Highland resources with international trade networks. The burgh's development involved systematic encouragement of specialised crafts, including textile production, metalworking and leather goods manufacturing that created exportable products while providing employment for growing urban populations. The privileges granted to royal burghs included exclusive trading rights within specified geographical areas, protection from arbitrary taxation, and legal autonomy that attracted merchants and craftsmen from across Europe. These privileges created competitive advantages that enabled Scottish burghs to compete with established commercial centres in England and continental Europe, while ensuring that commercial profits contributed to royal revenues through carefully structured tax systems. The establishment of standardised weights, measures, and currency systems throughout the royal burghs facilitated commercial transactions while demonstrating royal authority over economic affairs. David introduced silver coinage based on English models but bearing distinctively Scottish symbols and inscriptions that asserted the kingdom's independent status while enabling participation in international trade networks. The standardisation of commercial practices reduced transaction costs and disputes while enabling Scottish merchants to compete effectively in foreign markets. The attraction of foreign merchants and craftsmen to Scottish burghs required careful provision of legal protections and commercial privileges that would encourage immigration while ensuring their integration into Scottish society. David's policies offered foreign settlers the same legal rights and commercial opportunities enjoyed by native Scots, while providing additional protections against discrimination or arbitrary treatment. These policies proved particularly successful in attracting Flemish weavers, German merchants and English craftsmen whose skills and commercial connections enhanced Scottish economic capabilities. The development of international trade networks centred on Scottish burghs involved systematic cultivation of commercial relationships with established European trading centres. Scottish merchants established permanent representatives in London, Bruges and other major commercial cities, while foreign merchants received encouragement to establish operations in Scottish burghs. The export of Scottish wool, hides and agricultural products provided the foundation for these trade relationships, while imports of luxury goods, manufactured items and raw materials unavailable in Scotland enhanced the kingdom's economic sophistication. David's ecclesiastical reforms represented another crucial component of his comprehensive modernisation programme, involving the systematic establishment of major religious houses that served multiple functions as centres of learning, agricultural development and spiritual life, while strengthening royal authority through their integration into European monastic networks. The foundation of Melrose Abbey in 1136 marked the beginning of an ambitious programme of monastic establishment that would transform Scottish religious life while providing the Crown with powerful allies in implementing broader governmental reforms. The selection of Melrose as the site for David's premier monastic foundation reflected careful consideration of strategic, economic and spiritual factors that would enable the new abbey to fulfil multiple functions within his broader reform programme. Located in the fertile Tweed Valley near the English border, Melrose possessed excellent agricultural potential while commanding important transportation routes that facilitated communication with both Scottish and English religious centres. The site's proximity to the border also provided opportunities for the abbey to serve diplomatic functions, hosting negotiations between Scottish and English representatives while demonstrating Scottish commitment to European Christian traditions. The architectural design of Melrose Abbey reflected the latest continental European monastic building techniques, while incorporating elements adapted to Scottish conditions and materials. The Abbey Church, built in the Gothic style then emerging in France, featured soaring arches, elaborate stone carving and sophisticated engineering that demonstrated Scottish participation in broader European architectural developments. The monastic buildings surrounding the church provided comprehensive facilities for religious life, including dormitories, refectories, libraries and workshops that enabled the community to function as a self-sufficient economic and intellectual centre. The recruitment of monks for Melrose involved careful selection of individuals who possessed both spiritual dedication and practical skills necessary for the abbey's success. David arranged for experienced monks from Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire to establish the Scottish foundation, ensuring that Melrose would operate according to proven Cistercian practices while maintaining connections to the broader Cistercian network. These founding monks brought expertise in agriculture, manuscript production, and monastic administration that enabled rapid development of the abbey's economic and intellectual capabilities. The economic impact of Melrose Abbey extended far beyond its immediate vicinity to encompass systematic development of agricultural resources throughout the Borders region. The monks applied advanced farming techniques, including selective breeding of livestock, systematic crop rotation, and extensive land reclamation projects that increased agricultural productivity while generating surplus revenues for further monastic expansion. The abbey's wool production in particular became renowned throughout Europe for its quality, creating valuable export opportunities while demonstrating Scottish agricultural capabilities. Jedburgh Abbey, founded in 1138, represented another crucial element in David's monastic establishment programme, serving both religious and strategic functions in the volatile border region between Scotland and England. The abbey's location provided a secure base for royal administration in the borders, while demonstrating Scottish commitment to peaceful relations with England through the establishment of a major religious foundation near the frontier. The abbey's architectural grandeur, comparable to major English monastic centres, asserted Scottish cultural sophistication while providing facilities for diplomatic meetings and negotiations. The development of Jedburgh's intellectual capabilities involved systematic accumulation of manuscripts, establishment of educational programs, and cultivation of scholarly networks that connected the abbey to major European centres of learning. The abbey's scriptorium produced both religious texts and administrative documents for royal use, while its school attracted students from throughout Scotland and northern England. These educational activities enhanced Scottish intellectual capabilities while creating networks of educated clerics who could serve royal administrative needs. Kelso Abbey, established in 1128, completed David's programme of major monastic foundations in the Borders region, creating a network of religious houses that provided comprehensive coverage of the frontier area while serving multiple governmental functions. Kelso's strategic location at the confluence of the Tweed and Teviot rivers enabled the abbey to control river transportation while providing secure facilities for royal courts and administrative meetings. The abbey's extensive landholdings generated substantial revenues that supported both monastic activities and royal governmental needs. The integration of these major abbeys into European monastic networks provided Scotland with unprecedented connections to continental, intellectual and spiritual developments, while enhancing the kingdom's diplomatic capabilities. Abbots from Scottish houses participated in international monastic conferences, maintained correspondence with religious leaders throughout Europe, and facilitated diplomatic communications between the Scottish crown and foreign rulers. These connections elevated Scotland's international standing while providing access to new ideas and practices that enhance governmental effectiveness. The creation of David's sophisticated administrative system represented perhaps his most enduring contribution to Scottish governmental development, involving the systematic establishment of sheriffdoms, justiciars and royal courts that brought Scotland into alignment with contemporary European governmental practices while adapting these institutions to Scottish conditions and requirements. The sheriffdom system, borrowed from Anglo-Norman administrative practice, provided the foundation for royal control over distant territories while ensuring consistent application of royal law and policy throughout the kingdom. The appointment of sheriffs represented a fundamental departure from traditional Scottish governmental practices, which had relied primarily on personal relationships and informal arrangements between the crown and local nobles. Sheriffs received formal appointments with clearly defined territorial jurisdictions and specific administrative responsibilities, including tax collection, military recruitment, judicial administration, and enforcement of royal commands. These officials served at royal pleasure rather than through hereditary right, ensuring their loyalty to the crown while providing mechanisms for removing ineffective or disloyal administrators. The territorial organisation of sheriffdoms reflected careful consideration of geographical, economic and political factors that would enable effective administration while respecting traditional Scottish regional identities. Major sheriffdoms were established around important royal centres, including Edinburgh, Stirling, Perth and Aberdeen, with boundaries drawn to encompass coherent economic and geographical units that could support the administrative apparatus while providing adequate revenues for governmental operations. Smaller sheriffdoms were created in strategic locations where royal authority required particular attention, or where local conditions demanded specialised administrative approaches. The administrative foundations laid by David I reached their full maturation under his successors, particularly during the reigns of Alexander II and Alexander III, when Scotland emerged as a genuinely independent European power, capable of asserting its sovereignty against both English overlordship claims and Norse territorial ambitions. The resolution of the Treaty of Falaise, which had subjected Scotland to English feudal superiority since William the Lion's capture at Alnwick in 1174, marked the beginning of this transformation. while William had managed to purchase the cancellation of the treaty in 1189 for 10,000 marks to fund Richard III's crusading ambitions, the practical implications of Scottish subservience had lingered through diplomatic pressure and territorial disputes that continued to compromise Scottish independence. Alexander II's accession in 1214 coincided with the political turmoil in England, following King John's conflicts with his barons and the papal interdict that had paralysed English governmental functions. These circumstances provided unprecedented opportunities for Scottish territorial expansion and diplomatic manoeuvring that Alexander exploited with remarkable skill. His immediate priority involved the complete elimination of any remaining English claims to feudal overlordship over Scotland, a goal that required both military pressure and diplomatic negotiation conducted from a position of strength rather than the defensive posture that had characterised previous Scottish-English relations. The young king's first major military campaign in 1215 demonstrated his commitment to aggressive territorial expansion while exploiting English internal divisions. Scottish forces advanced deep into Northumberland, capturing the strategic fortress of Norham and establishing Scottish control over extensive territories that had remained disputed since Malcolm Canmore's campaigns. The Siege of Norham revealed the sophisticated military capabilities that Scotland had developed under Davidian reforms, with coordinated infantry and cavalry formations supported by siege engines that breached the castle's formidable stone fortifications. After a systematic investment lasting several weeks, Alexander's military innovations extended beyond mere tactical improvements to encompass fundamental changes in Scottish strategic doctrine that emphasised sustained territorial conquest rather than traditional raiding expeditions. Scottish forces employed advanced logistical systems that enabled extended campaigns far from Scottish bases, with organised supply trains providing provisions, ammunition and replacement equipment necessary for prolonged military operations. These capabilities enabled Scottish armies to maintain pressure on English positions while avoiding the precipitous withdrawals that had characterised earlier Celtic warfare patterns. The coordination between Scottish military operations and diplomatic initiatives revealed Alexander's sophisticated understanding of contemporary European political dynamics. While Scottish forces maintained military pressure on English frontier positions, Alexander simultaneously cultivated alliances with King John's baronial opponents, providing mutual support that weakened English resistance to Scottish territorial claims while demonstrating Scotland's emergence as an independent player in English internal politics. The Scottish king's marriage to Joan of England, King John's daughter, in 1221 formalised this diplomatic revolution, while providing additional security for Scottish territorial gains. The resolution of border disputes through the Treaty of York in 1237 represented the culmination of Alexander II's diplomatic achievements, establishing the modern Scottish-English frontier along lines that recognised substantial Scottish territorial gains, while providing mutual security guarantees that eliminated the chronic warfare that had characterised previous centuries. Under this agreement, Alexander renounced Scottish claims to Northumberland, Cumberland and Westmoreland in exchange for English recognition of Scottish sovereignty and substantial financial compensation. More importantly, the treaty explicitly acknowledged Scotland as an independent kingdom, owing no feudal obligations to the English crown, formally ending the subordinate relationship established by the Treaty of Falaise. The territorial arrangements established by the Treaty of York required complex negotiations regarding the status of nobles who held lands on both sides of the new frontier. Many Anglo-Norman families had acquired holdings in both kingdoms through marriage, inheritance and royal grants, creating potential conflicts of loyalty that threatened the stability of the new arrangements. Alexander's solution involved systematic exchanges of territory and compensation payments that enabled nobles to consolidate their holdings within single kingdoms while maintaining their social status and economic position. These arrangements demonstrated the king's commitment to practical solutions that served the interests of all parties while strengthening the new frontier arrangements. The expansion of royal authority into previously independent regions represented another crucial aspect of Alexander II's domestic achievements, involving systematic campaigns that brought the Western Highlands and Islands under direct Scottish control for the first time in the kingdom's history. The traditional independence of Highland clans and island chiefs had limited royal authority to the lowland regions, where Davidian administrative reforms had been successfully implemented, leaving vast territories under local control that compromised the kingdom's unity and military capabilities. Alexander's Highland campaigns employed innovative strategies that combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiation designed to secure voluntary submission rather than conquest through overwhelming force. Highland chiefs received offers of integration into the Scottish feudal hierarchy that preserved their local authority while acknowledging royal overlordship and providing military service when required. Those who accepted these arrangements retained control over their traditional territories while gaining access to royal protection and participation in the broader Scottish political system. The resistance encountered during these Highland campaigns revealed the formidable military capabilities of traditional Celtic warfare, adapted to challenging terrain that favoured defensive tactics. Highland warriors employed guerrilla strategies that exploited their intimate knowledge of local geography while avoiding direct confrontation with superior Scottish forces equipped with continental European military technology. These campaigns required sustained effort over multiple years, with Scottish forces gradually establishing control over strategic positions while negotiating with local leaders who recognised the futility of continued resistance. The establishment of royal administrative centres throughout the newly conquered Highland territories involved extensive construction projects that demonstrated royal authority while providing secure bases for ongoing governmental operations. New castles built at strategic locations, including Inverlochy and other Highland sites, employed the latest military architecture adapted to local conditions and available materials. These fortifications served multiple functions as military strongholds, administrative centres, and symbols of royal authority that reinforced Scottish control over territories that had previously operated with complete independence. The integration of Highland populations into the broader Scottish political system required careful accommodation of traditional Celtic social structures and legal practices that differed markedly from the feudal arrangements that governed lowland Scotland. Alexander's approach emphasised gradual transformation rather than sudden imposition of foreign practices, allowing Highland communities to maintain their clan-based organisation while accepting overarching royal authority. Traditional Highland law continued to govern local disputes and social relationships, while major crimes and matters affecting royal interests came under the jurisdiction of royal courts staffed by officials familiar with both Highland customs and royal legal requirements. The economic implications of Highland integration proved substantial, as royal authority enabled systematic development of previously unexploited natural resources while providing security for trade and commercial activities that had been disrupted by chronic warfare between competing clans. Highland territories possessed valuable resources including timber, minerals, and livestock that could contribute to royal revenues while supporting expanded trade networks. The establishment of royal protection for merchants and traders encouraged commercial activities that brought Highland communities into contact with broader Scottish economic networks while generating tax revenues for royal administration. Alexander III's accession in 1249 at the age of 7 required a regency government that maintained the momentum of territorial expansion and administrative development while managing the challenges inherent in royal minorities. The Regency Council, dominated by experienced nobles who had served Alexander II, continued aggressive policies toward remaining Norwegian territories in Scotland, while strengthening the administrative systems that had enabled previous Scottish achievements. The young king's eventual assumption of personal rule in 1262 mark the beginning of the most prosperous period in medieval Scottish history, characterised by territorial completion, economic expansion, and cultural flowering that established Scotland's reputation as a major European power. The resolution of Norwegian territorial claims through military conquest and diplomatic negotiation represented Alexander III's most significant achievement, eliminating the last foreign territorial presence in Scotland while demonstrating the kingdom's military capabilities against a formidable European power. Norwegian control over the Hebrides and other western islands had persisted since the Viking expansion of the 9th and 10th centuries, creating an anomalous situation where significant Scottish territories remained under foreign control, despite centuries of Scottish political development. King Haakon IV of Norway's invasion of Scotland in 1263 represented the final Norwegian attempt to maintain their Scottish territories through military force rather than diplomatic accommodation. The Norwegian expedition involved a massive fleet carrying thousands of warriors equipped with the latest Scandinavian military technology, demonstrating Norway's commitment to retaining their Scottish possessions despite growing Scottish pressure for territorial unification. Haakon's strategy involved coordinating naval operations with local supporters while establishing secure bases that could support sustained military operations against Scottish forces. The Battle of Largs in October 1263 marked the decisive confrontation between Scottish and Norwegian forces, resulting in a comprehensive Scottish victory that effectively ended Norwegian military presence in Scotland. The battle occurred when storms damaged the Norwegian fleet and forced substantial numbers of Norwegian warriors ashore, where they encountered Scottish forces commanded by Alexander III personally. The engagement demonstrated the effectiveness of Scottish military reforms, with coordinated cavalry and infantry formations defeating Norwegian forces despite their reputation for military prowess and their advantages in individual combat skills. The tactical details of Largs revealed the sophisticated military capabilities that Scotland had developed through centuries of warfare and military innovation. Scottish cavalry units employed coordinated charge tactics that disrupted Norwegian formations, while Scottish infantry maintained disciplined formations that prevented Norwegian counterattacks. The integration of different military units under unified command demonstrated the professional military capabilities that distinguished Scottish forces from the traditional war bands that had characterised earlier Celtic warfare. The aftermath of Largs involved systematic Scottish occupation of Norwegian-controlled territories throughout the Western Islands, with Scottish forces methodically capturing Norwegian strongholds while negotiating the submission of local chiefs who had previously acknowledged Norwegian overlordship. These operations required sophisticated logistical capabilities that enabled Scottish forces to maintain extended operations throughout the challenging island territories while providing adequate supplies and reinforcements for garrison forces left to secure captured positions. The Treaty of Perth in 1266 formalised the transfer of Norwegian territories to Scottish control through diplomatic arrangements that provided face-saving compensation to Norway while securing permanent Scottish sovereignty over all territories that would comprise the medieval Scottish kingdom. Under this agreement, Scotland paid Norway 4,000 marks immediately plus an annual payment of 100 marks in perpetuity, while Norway renounced all claims to Scottish territories except for Orkney and Shetland, which remained under Norwegian control until the 15th century. The economic arrangements established by the Treaty of Perth reflected sophisticated diplomatic practices that balanced Norwegian pride with Scottish territorial objectives, while creating sustainable financial arrangements that both kingdoms could maintain over extended periods. The annual payments to Norway were structured to acknowledge Norwegian historical claims while remaining sufficiently modest to avoid creating financial burdens that might encourage future Scottish attempts to repudiate the agreement. These arrangements demonstrated Alexander III's commitment to permanent solutions rather than temporary expedients that might require future military enforcement. The integration of the former Norwegian territories into the Scottish administrative system required extensive adaptation of existing governmental structures to accommodate the unique geographical and cultural characteristics of the island territories. The establishment of sheriffdoms in the islands involved modifications of standard Scottish administrative practices to account for the challenges of governing scattered island populations with limited overland communication capabilities. Island sheriffs received expanded authority and resources that enabled them to function effectively despite their isolation from central governmental support. The cultural implications of territorial unification extended far beyond mere administrative arrangements to encompass fundamental changes in Scottish identity and international relationships that reflected the kingdom's emergence as a complete territorial entity. The elimination of foreign territorial enclaves removed sources of external interference in Scottish internal affairs while creating opportunities for cultural and economic development that had been constrained by territorial fragmentation. Scottish merchants gained access to previously restricted island markets, while island populations acquired protection and commercial opportunities through integration into broader Scottish networks. The flourishing of Scottish culture during Alexander III's reign reflected both the stability provided by territorial completion and the prosperity generated by expanded trade networks that connected Scotland to major European commercial centres. The construction of magnificent stone cathedrals at St Andrews, Glasgow, and other major centres demonstrated Scottish participation in the Gothic architectural revolution, while showcasing the kingdom's wealth and cultural sophistication. These massive construction projects required coordination of skilled craftsmen, imported materials, and substantial financial resources that testified to Scotland's economic prosperity and administrative capabilities. St Andrew's Cathedral, begun during this period, represented the pinnacle of Scottish ecclesiastical architecture while serving as the ceremonial centre of Scottish Christianity. The cathedral's design incorporated the latest Gothic architectural innovations adapted to Scottish conditions and available materials, with soaring stone arches, elaborate sculptural decoration, and sophisticated engineering that rivaled contemporary European cathedral construction. The project required decades of sustained effort and enormous financial investment that demonstrated both royal commitment to ecclesiastical development and the kingdom's capacity to undertake major construction projects. The patronage of arts and literature during Alexander III's reign created cultural achievements that enhanced Scotland's international reputation while preserving Scottish traditions and historical memory for future generations. Royal support for manuscript production resulted in beautifully illuminated texts that combined Scottish artistic traditions with continental European stylistic influences, creating distinctive works that demonstrated Scottish cultural sophistication. The court attracted poets, musicians and scholars from throughout Europe, transforming Edinburgh and other royal centres into cosmopolitan cultural environments that competed with major European courts. The development of vernacular literature during this period reflected growing Scottish cultural confidence and the desire to preserve Scottish traditions in accessible forms that could serve both educational and entertainment functions. Epic poems celebrating Scottish military achievements, romantic literature exploring themes of courtly love and chivalric behaviour, and historical chronicles recording Scottish achievements provided cultural foundations that strengthened Scottish identity while demonstrating the kingdom's participation in broader European literary developments. The establishment of Scotland as a significant European power through strategic marriage alliances created diplomatic networks that enhanced Scottish security while providing access to international political developments that affected Scottish interests. Alexander III's marriage to Margaret of England strengthened Scottish-English relations while demonstrating Scottish equality with other European royal houses. Subsequent marriage negotiations involving Scottish royal family members with French, Norwegian and other European nobility reflected Scotland's emergence as a desirable diplomatic partner whose alliance was actively sought by major European powers. The economic foundations supporting Scottish international prominence involved systematic development of trade relationships that connected Scottish producers with European markets while generating revenues necessary for maintaining royal governmental systems and military capabilities. Scottish wool exports became particularly important in international commerce, with Scottish wool achieving recognition for quality that enabled premium pricing in Flemish and other European textile centres. The development of Scottish urban centres as commercial hubs attracted foreign merchants while providing Scottish traders with secure bases for international commercial operations. The diplomatic achievements of Alexander III's reign extended beyond territorial settlements to encompass broader European relationships that recognised Scotland's status as an independent kingdom capable of pursuing its own foreign policy objectives without external interference. Scottish diplomatic representatives participated in major European negotiations, while foreign embassies sought Scottish support for various international initiatives. These developments reflected Scotland's emergence from the peripheral status that had characterised earlier centuries to become a recognised participant in European political affairs. The prosperity and territorial consolidation achieved under Alexander III came to an abrupt and catastrophic end on a stormy March night in 1286, when the king's horse stumbled on the treacherous coastal path near Kinghorn in Fife, throwing its rider to his death on the rocks below. Alexander's decision to ride through the darkness to reach his young French wife Yolande at Kinghorn Castle, despite warnings from his counsellors about the dangerous weather conditions, would prove to be one of the most consequential personal choices in Scottish history. The 44-year-old king's death left Scotland without a clear male heir, as his sons Alexander and David had predeceased him, creating a succession crisis that would ultimately destroy Scottish independence and plunge the kingdom into decades of warfare. The immediate succession fell to Alexander's granddaughter Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway, the 3-year-old daughter of King Eric II of Norway and Alexander's deceased daughter Margaret. The child's tender age and residence in Norway created unprecedented challenges for Scottish governance, as the kingdom had never before faced the prospect of rule by an infant monarch living in a foreign court. The Scottish nobility, recognising the precarious nature of the situation, moved quickly to establish a regency government that could maintain royal authority while managing the complex diplomatic negotiations necessary to secure the young Queen's return to Scotland. The Regency Council, dominated by 6 guardians representing the major noble families and ecclesiastical authorities, faced immediate challenges that tested the administrative systems built up over previous centuries. The guardians included Bishop Fraser of St Andrews, the Comyns of Badenoch, the Bruces of Annandale, and other magnates whose competing interests and territorial ambitions created potential sources of conflict even as they worked together to preserve royal authority. Their primary responsibilities involved maintaining law and order throughout the kingdom, while conducting delicate negotiations with Norway regarding Margaret's eventual return and with England regarding the broad political implications of Scottish royal minority. The diplomatic complexity surrounding Margaret's status reflected the international connections that Scottish royal marriages had created over previous generations. As the daughter of the Norwegian king, Margaret possessed claims to Norwegian inheritance that complicated her position as Scottish queen, while her youth made her an attractive candidate for marriage alliances that could reshape the political landscape of Northern Europe. King Edward I of England immediately recognised the opportunities presented by the Scottish succession crisis, proposing a marriage between Margaret and his own son Edward of Caernarfon that would unite the Scottish and English crowns under English control. The Treaty of Bergen, negotiated in 1290, represented a sophisticated attempt to balance Scottish independence with English ambitions through carefully structured arrangements that would preserve Scottish governmental autonomy while creating the dynastic union that Edward I desired. Under the proposed terms, Scotland would retain its separate legal system, administrative structures, and ecclesiastical independence, even after the marriage united the two crowns. Scottish nobles would hold their lands directly from the Scottish crown rather than becoming vassals of the English king, while Scottish legal traditions and governmental practices would continue unchanged despite the dynastic connection. The careful legal language of the Birgham negotiations revealed the Scottish nobility's determination to preserve their kingdom's independence even while accepting the practical benefits of alliance with England. Scottish negotiators insisted upon explicit guarantees that Scotland would remain separate and divided from England, with its own parliament, courts, and administrative systems functioning independently of English governmental control. These provisions reflected lessons learned from previous periods of English overlordship and demonstrated Scottish commitment to maintaining their distinct national identity regardless of dynastic arrangements. The tragic death of Margaret during her voyage to Scotland in September 1290 destroyed these carefully constructed arrangements and created the succession crisis that would dominate Scottish politics for the next 2 decades. The 7-year-old Queen died in Orkney, possibly from seasickness or disease contracted during the difficult North Sea crossing, leaving Scotland without any direct heir to Alexander III's line. Her death eliminated the possibility of peaceful dynastic union with England, while creating a complex legal situation in which multiple claimants possessed arguable rights to the Scottish throne based on different interpretations of royal inheritance law. The emergence of competing claims to the Scottish succession revealed the complex genealogical relationships that connected the major Scottish noble families to the royal house, while highlighting fundamental disagreements about the principles that should govern royal inheritance. The two primary claimants, John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder, both possessed legitimate claims based on descent from David I, but their competing arguments reflected different legal theories about the relative importance of primogeniture versus proximity of blood relationship to the deceased monarch. John Balliol's claim rested upon his descent from Margaret, the eldest daughter of David of Huntingdon, who had been the younger brother of Kings Malcolm IV and William the Lion. Balliol's supporters argued that the principle of primogeniture, which governed inheritance throughout feudal Europe, clearly established his superior right to the throne regardless of the fact that his claim passed through female descent. The Balliol argument emphasised that Margaret's position as the eldest child of David of Huntingdon gave her descendants priority over the descendants of younger siblings, following the same legal principles that governed inheritance of other feudal properties throughout Scotland and England. The legal sophistication of the Balliol claim reflected the influence of continental European legal scholarship on Scottish inheritance law, as Balliol's supporters cited precedents from Roman law, canon law, and contemporary European legal practice to support their arguments. They pointed to similar succession disputes in other European kingdoms where primogeniture had been upheld despite female descent, arguing that Scotland should follow established European legal principles rather than creating unique inheritance rules that might compromise the kingdom's international standing. Robert Bruce the Elder's claim derived from his position as the son of Isabel, the second daughter of David of Huntingdon, but his supporters argued that proximity of blood relationship to the royal line should take precedence over strict primogeniture when determining royal succession. The Bruce argument emphasised that Robert was one generation closer to the common royal ancestor than John Balliol, making him the nearest living relative to the deceased king regardless of the gender of intermediate ancestors. Bruce supporters contended that royal succession should follow different principles than ordinary feudal inheritance, as kingship involved personal relationships and military leadership that required the closest possible blood connection to the royal line. The Bruce legal position drew upon Celtic inheritance traditions that had historically governed Scottish royal succession, arguing that these established practices should take precedence over foreign legal innovations that might compromise Scottish independence and traditional governmental structures. Bruce supporters pointed to historical precedents in Scottish royal succession, where proximity of blood had been considered more important than strict primogeniture, particularly in cases where the succession involved female descent or complex genealogical relationships. Additional claimants complicated the legal situation further, as John Hastings claimed that the kingdom should be divided among all 3 daughters of David of Huntingdon, following the principle of partible inheritance that governed some feudal properties. Hastings argued that Scotland should be treated as a feudal inheritance subject to division, rather than as an indivisible kingdom, a position that would have created multiple Scottish kingdoms and effectively destroyed the unified state that had been built up over previous centuries. The complexity of these competing legal arguments created a situation that transcended the capabilities of Scottish legal institutions, as no existing Scottish court possessed the authority or expertise necessary to adjudicate between claims that involved fundamental questions about the nature of kingship and the legal principles governing royal succession. The Scottish nobility recognised that any decision made by a purely Scottish tribunal would likely be rejected by unsuccessful claimants and could lead to civil war that would destroy the kingdom, regardless of the legal merits of different positions. The invitation to Edward I of England to serve as arbitrator in the succession dispute represented a fateful decision that reflected both the Scottish nobility's desperation to avoid civil war and their fundamental misunderstanding of Edward's character and ambitions. Edward had established a reputation as an effective legal arbitrator in previous European disputes, while his relationship with Alexander III had been generally cordial and based on mutual respect between independent monarchs. Scottish nobles apparently believed that Edward would approach the Scottish succession dispute as a neutral arbitrator whose decision would be accepted by all parties and would restore stability to Scottish governance. Edward's acceptance of the arbitration role came with conditions that should have alerted Scottish nobles to his broader ambitions, as he insisted upon recognition of his overlordship over Scotland before proceeding with the legal adjudication. Edward argued that only a feudal superior possessed the authority to determine succession disputes within subordinate territories, and that his arbitration could only be legitimate if the Scottish claimants acknowledged his position as overlord of Scotland. This demand transformed what Scottish nobles had envisioned as neutral arbitration into a proceeding that would fundamentally alter Scotland's international status regardless of which claimant ultimately received the crown. The legal arguments presented during the Great Cause proceedings at Norham Castle in 1291 to 1292 revealed the sophisticated legal scholarship that both sides brought to bear on the succession question, as teams of lawyers trained in Canaan law, Roman law, and feudal legal practice presented detailed arguments that drew upon precedents from across medieval Europe. The proceedings attracted legal scholars from throughout Europe who recognized the broader implications of the decision for feudal inheritance law and royal succession principles that affected multiple kingdoms. Edward's court included some of the most distinguished legal minds in medieval Europe, including experts in Roman law from continental universities who brought theoretical sophistication to the practical questions of Scottish royal succession. The legal proceedings involved detailed examination of genealogical evidence, analysis of previous succession disputes in other European kingdoms, and theoretical discussions about the relationship between feudal inheritance principles and royal succession law that created an extensive legal record documenting the various arguments presented by different parties. The decision in favour of John Balliol in November 1292 reflected Edward's careful legal analysis of the competing claims according to established feudal inheritance principles, as Balliol's position as senior heir according to primogeniture gave him the strongest claim under the legal systems that governed inheritance throughout medieval Europe. However, Edward's decision also served his political interests by placing on the Scottish throne a king whose legal position depended entirely upon English recognition. and who would therefore be susceptible to English pressure in future disputes. John Balliol's coronation at Scone in November 1292 marked the beginning of the most humiliating period in medieval Scottish royal history, as the new king found himself caught between his obligations to maintain Scottish independence and the practical reality of his dependence upon English support for his contested legitimacy. Edward there immediately began treating Balliol as a subordinate feudal vassal rather than as an independent monarch, summoning him to answer legal appeals in English courts and demanding Scottish military service for English campaigns that served no Scottish interests. The systematic humiliation of Scottish royal authority became apparent through a series of incidents that demonstrated Edward's determination to reduce Scotland to the status of an English province rather than maintaining even the pretense of Scottish independence. Edward summoned Balliol to answer appeals from Scottish legal decisions in English courts, undermining the independence of Scottish legal institutions while asserting English judicial supremacy over Scottish royal authority. These demands violated fundamental principles of royal sovereignty and demonstrated Edward's contempt for the legal arrangements that had supposedly preserved Scottish independence during the succession arbitration. The crisis reached its climax when Edward demanded Scottish military service for his campaigns in France, treating Scotland as an English feudal dependency obligated to provide military support for English foreign policy objectives. This demand violated every principle of Scottish independence and forced Balliol to choose between submission to English overlordship and resistance that would inevitably lead to English invasion. The Scottish nobility, recognising that continued submission would permanently destroy Scottish independence, pressured Balliol to reject Edward's demands and assert Scottish sovereignty regardless of the military consequences. The Scottish alliance with France in 1295, known as the Old Alliance, represented a desperate attempt to secure foreign support for Scottish resistance to English overlordship, while establishing the diplomatic framework that would influence Scottish foreign policy for centuries. The alliance with France provided Scotland with a powerful ally whose own conflicts with England created mutual interests in resisting English expansion, while offering Scotland access to French military expertise and resources that could help offset English advantages in population and wealth. The French alliance negotiations revealed the sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that Scotland had developed during its period of independence, as Scottish ambassadors successfully negotiated complex agreements that balanced Scottish needs with French strategic objectives, while creating sustainable arrangements that both kingdoms could maintain over extended periods. The alliance provisions included mutual military support against English aggression, trade agreements that provided Scotland with access to French markets, and diplomatic cooperation that enhanced Scottish international standing while serving French interests in limiting English power. Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1296 represented a systematic attempt to destroy Scottish independence through overwhelming military force combined with symbolic actions designed to demonstrate the permanent subjugation of Scottish royal authority. Edward's army, numbering over 30,000 men and representing one of the largest military forces assembled in medieval Europe, crossed the Scottish border with the explicit objective of conquering Scotland, rather than merely punishing Scottish resistance to English overlordship. The sack of Berwick-upon-Tweed in March 1296 demonstrated Edward's determination to terrorise Scottish resistance through extreme brutality that violated contemporary standards of warfare and established precedents for the savage conduct that would characterise the subsequent English occupation. English forces systematically slaughtered the civilian population of Scotland's premier commercial centre, killing thousands of merchants, craftsmen and ordinary citizens who posed no military threat to English forces. The massacre served no military purpose but was designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance to English authority while destroying Scotland's most important commercial centre. The destruction of Berwick eliminated Scotland's primary connection to international trade networks while demonstrating English determination to destroy Scottish economic capabilities rather than merely establishing political control. The systematic burning of warehouses, workshops, and residential areas destroyed decades of commercial development, while eliminating the infrastructure necessary for Scotland's participation in European trade. The economic impact extended far beyond immediate destruction to encompass the loss of commercial relationships and international connections that had taken generations to develop. The Battle of Dunbar in April 1296 resulted in the complete collapse of Scottish military resistance as English forces defeated a hastily assembled Scottish army that lacked the coordination and leadership necessary to resist Edward's professional military machine. The Scottish defeat reflected not only English military superiority, but also the political divisions within Scotland that prevented effective coordination of resistance efforts. Many Scottish nobles remained uncertain about their obligations to Balliol's contested kingship, while others calculated that submission to Edward might preserve their lands and local authority. The capture and humiliation of John Balliol following Dunbar marked the effective end of Scottish independence as Edward systematically stripped away the symbols and institutions of Scottish royal authority. Balliol's forced abdication and the removal of his royal regalia, including the ceremonial tearing of the royal arms from his surcoat that earned him the derisive nickname Tomb Tabard or Empty Coat, demonstrated Edward's determination to eliminate any possibility of future Scottish claims to independent kingship. The removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey to Westminster represented perhaps the most symbolically significant action of Edward's conquest, as the ancient inauguration stone had served as the focal point of Scottish royal ceremonies for centuries and embodied the continuity of Scottish kingship stretching back to Kenneth MacAlpin. Edward's decision to transport the stone to Westminster and incorporate it into his own coronation throne demonstrated his intention to absorb Scottish royal authority into English kingship, rather than merely establishing English overlordship over a subordinate Scottish kingdom. The systematic destruction of Scottish governmental records and legal documents eliminated the documentary foundation of Scottish administrative independence, while preventing future Scottish rulers from accessing the legal precedents and administrative records necessary for effective governance. English forces deliberately targeted Scottish monasteries and administrative centres where royal records were maintained, destroying centuries of accumulated governmental documentation that had provided the foundation for Scottish legal and administrative systems. The establishment of English administrative control over Scotland involved the appointment of English officials to replace Scottish governmental institutions, while implementing English legal and administrative systems throughout the conquered territories. Edward appointed John de Warenne as Guardian of Scotland, with authority to govern the conquered kingdom according to English law, while English sheriffs replaced Scottish administrative officials throughout the kingdom. These appointments eliminated Scottish participation in their own governance while ensuring that conquered territories would be administered according to English rather than Scottish legal traditions. The resistance that began to emerge even during the initial phase of English occupation demonstrated that Edward's conquest had failed to eliminate Scottish national consciousness, despite the destruction of Scottish governmental institutions and royal authority. Individual acts of defiance, attacks on English officials, and the preservation of Scottish legal and cultural traditions in areas beyond direct English control indicated that Scottish identity had survived the political catastrophe of conquest and would provide the foundation for future resistance movements that would ultimately restore Scottish independence. The emergence of William Wallace as a leader of Scottish resistance represented a fundamental departure from traditional patterns of medieval rebellion, which typically centred on competing claims to legitimate authority by established noble houses. Wallace possessed no hereditary claim to high political office, no extensive land holdings that provided automatic military resources, and no established position within the Scottish feudal hierarchy that would have made him a natural focus for resistance activities. His father, Malcolm Wallace, held lands at Elderslie in Renfrewshire as a minor landholder, whose social status placed him well below the great magnates who normally dominated Scottish politics, yet whose position as a free landholder gave him sufficient independence to resist English administrative pressure. Wallace's early involvement in resistance activities remains obscured by the limited documentary evidence that survives from this period, but contemporary accounts suggest that his initial actions involved localised resistance to English administrative demands, rather than coordinated military campaigns designed to restore Scottish independence. The transformation of these individual acts of defiance into systematic military resistance required both personal qualities of leadership that distinguished Wallace from other potential resistance leaders, and circumstances that provided opportunities for expanding local resistance into broader military campaigns. The killing of William Heselrigg, Sheriff of Lanark, in May 1297 marked Wallace's emergence as a significant military leader, whose actions transcended mere personal revenge to encompass broader challenges to English administrative control over Scottish territories. Contemporary accounts of Heselrigg's death vary in their details, but most sources agree that Wallace's attack on the English sheriff involved careful planning and coordination with other Scottish resistors, rather than spontaneous violence arising from personal grievances. The systematic nature of the attack, which eliminated not only Heselrigg but also several of his administrative subordinates, demonstrated Wallace's understanding that effective resistance required the disruption of English governmental systems rather than merely symbolic acts of defiance. The immediate aftermath of Heselrigg's death revealed Wallace's remarkable ability to transform localised resistance into coordinated military campaigns that attracted support from across Scottish society. Within weeks of the Lanark incident, Wallace had assembled a force numbering several hundred men drawn from diverse social backgrounds, including minor landholders, urban craftsmen, rural peasants, and dispossessed members of the Scottish nobility who had lost their positions through English conquest. This heterogeneous military force reflected Wallace's appeal across traditional social boundaries, while demonstrating his ability to provide effective military leadership despite his lack of formal military training or noble birth. Wallace's military innovations became apparent during the summer campaigns of 1297, when his forces employed guerrilla tactics that exploited Scottish geographical advantages while avoiding direct confrontation with superior English heavy cavalry formations. Scottish resistance forces operated from bases in the dense forests and mountainous regions that provided natural protection from English military superiority while enabling rapid movement between different operational areas. These tactics required intimate knowledge of local terrain, combined with disciplined coordination among forces that lack the formal military training typical of contemporary European armies. The coordination between Wallace's military campaigns and parallel resistance activities, led by Andrew Moray in northern Scotland, demonstrated the emergence of a genuinely national resistance movement that transcended regional loyalties and personal ambitions. Moray, whose social background as heir to a prominent noble family differed markedly from Wallace's minor landholder origins, had escaped from English captivity and established resistance operations throughout the northern regions, where his family's traditional influence provided ready access to military resources and local support networks. Moray's military campaigns in the north employed different tactical approaches than Wallace's southern operations, reflecting both the different geographical conditions and the varying social structures that characterised different regions of Scotland. Northern Scotland's clan-based social organisation provided Moray with access to traditional military formations and leadership structures that had survived English conquest more effectively than the feudal arrangements that had dominated southern Scotland. Moray's forces included substantial numbers of Highland warriors whose traditional military skills and intimate knowledge of challenging terrain enabled effective resistance operations against English forces that were equipped and trained for different types of warfare. The convergence of Wallace and Moray's forces for the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Stirling Bridge represented a crucial moment in Scottish resistance strategy, as the two leaders successfully coordinated their separate military organisations into a unified force capable of challenging English military control over central Scotland. The selection of Stirling as the focus for this coordinated campaign reflected sophisticated strategic thinking that recognised the town's crucial position, controlling communications between northern and southern Scotland, while providing access to the fertile agricultural regions that supplied English occupation forces. The English response to growing Scottish resistance revealed fundamental misunderstandings of the nature and scope of the resistance movement, as English commanders initially treated Scottish military activities as localised disturbances that could be suppressed through conventional military operations, rather than recognising the emergence of a coordinated national resistance movement. John de Warenne, Edward the Suez, appointed Guardian of Scotland, assembled an army that included substantial numbers of English heavy cavalry and infantry forces, equipped according to contemporary European military standards. But his tactical planning reflected assumptions about Scottish military capabilities that proved dangerously outdated. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, demonstrated Wallace's tactical genius through innovative deployment of Scottish forces that transformed apparent English military advantages into fatal vulnerabilities. Wallace positioned his army on the northern side of the River Forth, allowing English forces to begin crossing the narrow bridge that provided the only practical crossing point in the immediate vicinity. The bridge's limited width meant that English forces could only cross in small numbers, negating their advantages in total force size, while creating opportunities for Scottish forces to engage superior English units under favourable tactical conditions. Wallace's timing of the Scottish attack revealed his sophisticated understanding of medieval military psychology and tactical coordination, as he allowed approximately half the English force to cross the bridge before launching his assault. This decision demonstrated remarkable tactical discipline, as premature attack would have enabled English forces to retreat across the bridge and reorganise their assault, while delayed attack might have allowed the entire English army to cross and deploy in effective battle formations. The precise timing required careful observation of English movements, combined with disciplined control over Scottish forces that were eager to engage their enemies. The tactical execution of the Scottish assault involved coordinated infantry formations that exploited the confined space available to English forces while preventing organised English retreat across the bridge. Scottish forces employed long spears and other weapons specifically chosen for close-quarters combat in restricted terrain, while their intimate knowledge of local ground conditions enabled rapid movement and tactical flexibility that English forces could not match. The battle demonstrated that properly led and coordinated Scottish infantry could defeat English heavy cavalry when tactical conditions negated English advantages in individual combat skills and military equipment. The death of Andrew Moray during the battle deprived the Scottish resistance of one of its most capable military leaders, while leaving Wallace as the sole commander of Scottish forces at the moment of their greatest military success. Moray's loss represented more than the death of an individual leader, as his noble birth and family connections had provided crucial legitimacy for the resistance movement among Scottish nobles, who might otherwise have remained neutral or actively supported English rule. Wallace's elevation to sole leadership required him to assume political responsibilities for which his social background had not prepared him, while managing military campaigns that demanded increasingly sophisticated coordination and strategic planning. The aftermath of Stirling Bridge revealed the broader implications of Scottish military success, as news of the English defeat spread rapidly throughout Scotland and encouraged additional resistance activities in regions that had previously accepted English occupation. The psychological impact of demonstrating that English forces could be defeated encouraged Scottish nobles who had submitted to English rule to reconsider their positions, while providing ordinary Scots with evidence that effective resistance was possible despite English military and administrative advantages. Wallace's assumption of the title Guardian of Scotland reflected both his military achievements and the complex political situation created by the absence of legitimate royal authority following John Balliol's forced abdication. The guardianship represented an innovative constitutional arrangement that provided Wallace with the authority necessary for coordinating national resistance, while avoiding claims to royal authority that might have alienated potential supporters who remained loyal to Balliol or other claimants to the Scottish throne. Wallace's guardianship drew its legitimacy from military success and popular support rather than hereditary right or ecclesiastical appointment, establishing precedents for Scottish governmental arrangements that would influence later constitutional developments. The international implications of Scottish military success became apparent through Wallace's diplomatic initiatives, designed to secure foreign support for continued resistance against English occupation. Wallace's embassy to the French court in 1298 demonstrated his understanding that Scottish independence required international recognition and support that could offset English advantages in population and resources. The Scottish diplomatic mission successfully negotiated French acknowledgement of Scottish independence while securing promises of military assistance that provided crucial international legitimacy for the resistance movement. Wallace's diplomatic activities revealed sophisticated understanding of contemporary European political relationships, as he successfully presented Scottish resistance as part of broader European opposition to English expansion, rather than merely a localised rebellion against legitimate authority. French support for Scottish independence served French strategic interests by creating military pressure on England's northern frontier while demonstrating French commitment to limiting English territorial expansion. The diplomatic success provided Scotland with international recognition that strengthened the resistance movement's legitimacy, while creating obligations for continued French support. The military innovations that Wallace introduced during his guardianship reflected both his tactical genius and his systematic efforts to adapt Scottish military capabilities to meet the challenges of sustained warfare against English occupation forces. Wallace's military reforms included improved training for Scottish infantry formations, standardisation of weapons and equipment that enhanced tactical coordination, and development of supply systems that enabled extended military campaigns far from traditional Scottish bases. These innovations transformed Scottish military forces from loosely coordinated resistance bands into disciplined armies capable of sustained operations against professional English forces. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, demonstrated both the achievements and limitations of Wallace's military innovations when Scottish forces encountered Edward's personal leadership of a reorganised English army that had adapted its tactics to counter Scottish advantages revealed at Stirling Bridge. Edward's army included substantial numbers of Welsh longbowmen whose missile capabilities provided English forces with tactical options that had been unavailable during previous campaigns, while English cavalry formations employed new tactical approaches designed specifically to counter Scottish infantry tactics that had proven effective at Stirling Bridge. Wallace's tactical deployment at Falkirk revealed his continued innovative approach to battlefield command, as he arranged Scottish forces in defensive formations known as schiltrons that maximised the effectiveness of Scottish spear-armed infantry while providing protection against English cavalry charges. The schiltron formations consisted of circular or rectangular arrangements of spearmen whose long weapons created protective barriers that cavalry could not penetrate, while maintaining sufficient tactical flexibility to respond to changing battlefield conditions. These formations represented adaptations of traditional Scottish military practices to meet the specific challenges posed by English heavy cavalry. The failure of Scottish cavalry and the defection of Scottish nobles during the battle revealed the continuing political divisions within Scottish society that undermined military effectiveness despite Wallace's tactical innovations. Scottish heavy cavalry, composed primarily of nobles whose loyalty to the resistance movement remained questionable, withdrew from the battle at crucial moments when their support might have enabled Scottish victory. The noble defections reflected both genuine disagreements about resistance strategy and personal calculations about the likely consequences of continued opposition to English rule. The tactical success of English longbowmen at Falkirk demonstrated the evolution of medieval military technology in ways that challenged traditional Scottish military advantages while requiring fundamental adaptations in Scottish tactical approaches. Welsh longbowmen could deliver sustained missile attacks that disrupted Scottish infantry formations from distances that prevented Scottish retaliation, while their rapid rate of fire created casualty levels that Scottish forces could not sustain in static defensive positions. The battle revealed that Scottish military success required tactical innovations that could counter English missile advantages while preserving Scottish strengths in infantry combat. Wallace's resignation from the guardianship following the Falkirk defeat reflected both his recognition of the military realities revealed by the battle and his commitment to Scottish independence that transcended personal ambition or desire for continued political authority. The resignation demonstrated Wallace's understanding that effective resistance leadership required adaptation to changing military and political circumstances, while his continued involvement in diplomatic activities revealed his ongoing commitment to Scottish independence, despite the temporary setback represented by military defeat. The period following Wallace's resignation witnessed continued Scottish resistance activities led by new guardians, including Robert Bruce and John Comyn, whose noble birth provided different types of legitimacy while their family resources enabled different approaches to resistance organisation. However, the continuing English military pressure and the internal divisions among Scottish nobles created increasingly difficult circumstances for coordinating effective resistance, while Edward VI's systematic campaigns of destruction eliminated much of the economic foundation necessary for sustained military operations. Wallace's capture near Glasgow in August 1305 resulted from betrayal by Scottish associates whose motivations reflected the complex personal and political calculations that influenced individual decisions about resistance participation. The circumstances of Wallace's capture revealed the extent to which English administrative control and the systematic use of rewards for information had penetrated Scottish society, while demonstrating the personal risks that resistance leaders faced, even in regions where popular support for independence remained strong. The trial of Wallace in Westminster Hall represented Edward VI's attempt to provide legal justification for his conquest of Scotland, while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to English authority through elaborate ceremonial procedures designed to emphasise Wallace's supposed status as a rebel against legitimate English overlordship. The charges against Wallace included treason, murder, arson, and sacrilege, accusations that reflected English legal theories about the relationship between England and Scotland, while ignoring Scottish claims to independent sovereignty that provided alternative legal frameworks for evaluating Wallace's actions. Wallace's execution on August 23, 1305, involved the full ceremonial brutality of medieval punishment for treason, with procedures designed to demonstrate English authority while serving as a warning to potential future resistors. The elaborate nature of Wallace's execution, including drawing, hanging, disemboweling, beheading, and quartering, exceeded normal punishment even for treason, and reflected Edward's determination to eliminate Wallace as a symbol of Scottish resistance, while demonstrating the consequences of challenging English rule. The execution of William Wallace in August 1305 marked what Edward believed would be the final chapter in Scottish resistance to English rule. Yet the brutal display of royal justice that scattered Wallace's remains across 4 Scottish towns achieved precisely the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than crushing Scottish aspirations for independence, Wallace's martyrdom crystallised opposition to English occupation while providing a powerful symbol that would inspire the most remarkable transformation in medieval Scottish history. Within months of Wallace's death, the complex web of noble rivalries, territorial ambitions, and personal grievances that had fragmented Scottish resistance would converge around an unlikely figure whose path to the throne would be paved with sacrilege, excommunication, and ultimately triumph. Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and grandson of the competitor who had lost the great cause to John Balliol, had spent the decade following Edward's conquest navigating the treacherous currents of Anglo-Scottish politics with calculated pragmatism that often placed him at odds with his own nationalist inclinations. His family's substantial landholdings in both Scotland and England created conflicting loyalties that forced Bruce to balance his hereditary claims to the Scottish throne against the practical necessity of maintaining Edward's favour to protect his English estates. This delicate equilibrium had led Bruce to fight alongside English forces at Falkirk, earning him the bitter enmity of many Scots who viewed such collaboration as treasonous, while his periodic involvement in Scottish resistance activities had generated suspicion among English administrators who questioned his ultimate reliability. The deteriorating relationship between Bruce and Edward I during 1305 reflected growing tensions over territorial disputes and Bruce's increasing frustration with his subordinate position within the English political system. Edward's systematic redistribution of Scottish lands to English nobles had threatened Bruce's own territorial holdings, while demonstrating that even cooperative Scottish nobles could expect no permanent security under English rule. The king's dismissive treatment of Bruce's legal claims and his apparent preference for other Scottish collaborators had gradually convinced Bruce that his future lay not in accommodation with English authority, but in asserting his hereditary rights to independent Scottish kingship. The fateful meeting between Robert Bruce and John Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries on February 10th, 1306, brought together the two most powerful claimants to Scottish leadership in circumstances that would transform both Scottish history and Bruce's personal destiny. Comyn, whose family had dominated Scottish politics during the interregnum, and whose own royal connections provided alternative claims to the throne, represented the primary obstacle to Bruce's ambitions, while possessing the territorial resources and noble connections necessary for effective resistance leadership. The church setting, chosen presumably to provide neutral ground for sensitive negotiations, would instead witness an act of violence that would forever alter the character of both men's legacies. Contemporary accounts of the confrontation vary significantly in their details, but most sources agree that the meeting began as an attempt to coordinate resistance activities between the two most prominent Scottish nobles before degenerating into heated argument over competing claims to leadership and ultimate authority. Bruce's supporters later claimed that Comyn had threatened to betray Bruce's treasonous communications to Edward I, while Comyn's allies maintained that Bruce had attempted to coerce Comyn into renouncing his own legitimate claims to royal authority. The precise sequence of events that led to violence remains disputed, but the outcome was undeniable. John Comyn lay dying on the church floor, struck down by Bruce's dagger in an act that violated both sacred sanctuary and feudal law. The immediate aftermath of Comyn's death revealed Bruce's remarkable ability to transform personal catastrophe into political opportunity through decisive action that committed him irrevocably to the cause of Scottish independence. Rather than fleeing to seek English forgiveness for his crime, Bruce moved immediately to consolidate support among his allies, while seizing the initiative before Comyn supporters could organise effective retaliation. His supporters quickly secured Dumfries Castle and began mobilising military forces throughout southwestern Scotland, while Bruce himself rode north towards Scone to claim the Scottish crown before news of Comyn's death could reach Edward I and precipitate immediate English military response. The sacrilegious nature of Comyn's murder created immediate ecclesiastical complications that threatened to undermine Bruce's legitimacy before his kingship could be established. The killing of a prominent nobleman within a consecrated church violated fundamental principles of medieval Christianity, while subjecting Bruce to automatic excommunication that would theoretically release all Christians from any obligation to acknowledge his authority. Pope Clement V's subsequent formal excommunication of Bruce created diplomatic obstacles that complicated Scottish efforts to secure international recognition, while providing Edward I with additional justification for treating Bruce as a criminal rather than a legitimate claimant to royal authority. Bruce's coronation at Scone on March 25, 1306, represented both the culmination of his dynastic ambitions and the beginning of the most challenging period of his life, as he assumed the Scottish crown under circumstances that provided minimal resources for defending his new kingdom against inevitable English retaliation. The ceremony itself reflected the desperate circumstances surrounding Bruce's elevation, as the absence of the Stone of Destiny, removed by Edward I a decade earlier, required improvised arrangements that lack the traditional symbols of Scottish royal authority. The participation of Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, in placing the crown upon Bruce's head provided crucial legitimacy through her family's hereditary right to crown Scottish kings, but her presence could not disguise the fact that many of Scotland's most powerful nobles remained absent from the ceremony. The limited attendance at Bruce's coronation revealed the extent to which Scottish noble society remained divided over the wisdom of renewed resistance to English rule, as many prominent families calculated that the risks of supporting Bruce's uncertain enterprise outweighed the potential benefits of Scottish independence. The Comyn family's extensive kinship networks ensured that Bruce's murder of John Comyn had created implacable enemies whose opposition would persist throughout his reign, while other nobles who had accommodated themselves to English rule during the previous decade hesitated to abandon secure positions for the uncertain prospects offered by Bruce's rebellion. Edward the Skeezer's response to news of Bruce's coronation demonstrated the English king's determination to crush Scottish independence permanently through military campaigns that would eliminate not merely Bruce's political authority, but the entire Scottish noble class that might support future resistance efforts. The ageing English monarch, despite his deteriorating health, personally assumed command of the military response while issuing orders that revealed his intention to conduct a war of extermination, rather than the more limited campaigns that had characterized previous Anglo-Scottish conflicts. Edward's instructions to his commanders included explicit authorization to execute captured Scottish nobles without trial, to destroy Scottish religious houses that provided sanctuary for resistors, and to implement systematic devastation of Scottish agricultural resources that would prevent future military campaigns. The English military response began with coordinated attacks from multiple directions, designed to prevent Bruce from consolidating his position, while demonstrating English determination to eliminate Scottish resistance through overwhelming force. Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, advanced from the south with a substantial army that included veteran soldiers from Edward's Welsh and continental campaigns, while other English forces moved to secure strategic positions throughout Scotland that would prevent Bruce from accessing traditional resistance strongholds. The speed and coordination of the English response revealed the extent of Edward's preparations for dealing with renewed Scottish resistance, while the size of the forces involved demonstrated his commitment to achieving permanent resolution of the Scottish problem. The Battle of Methven on June 19, 1306, provided Bruce with his first harsh lesson in the realities of medieval warfare against professional English forces, as his hastily assembled army suffered catastrophic defeat that scattered his supporters and forced the new king to flee for his life into the Scottish wilderness. The engagement revealed fundamental weaknesses in Bruce's initial military strategy, as his forces lacked the training, equipment and coordination necessary to face English heavy cavalry in conventional battle. The defeat eliminated most of Bruce's noble supporters through death or capture, while forcing the king to abandon his territorial base and seek refuge in regions where English administrative control remained limited. The aftermath of Methven witnessed systematic English efforts to eliminate Bruce's remaining supporters through executions that violated traditional medieval practices regarding the treatment of captured nobles, demonstrating Edward the Solid's determination to prevent future Scottish resistance through terror tactics that would discourage noble participation in independence movements. The executions of Christopher Seaton, Thomas Bruce, and other prominent supporters sent clear messages about the consequences of supporting Bruce's claim, while eliminating experienced military leaders whose loss significantly weakened Scottish resistance capabilities. Edward's orders that captured Scottish nobles should be hanged, drawn and quartered like common criminals, rather than receiving the honourable deaths traditionally accorded to defeated enemies of royal blood, revealed his intention to destroy Scottish noble society as a political force. Bruce's flight into the Western Highlands and Islands following Methven marked the beginning of a period of guerrilla warfare that would transform both his understanding of military strategy and his relationship with ordinary Scottish populations, who had previously remained largely peripheral to noble political conflicts. The king's reduced circumstances, travelling with a small band of loyal followers and dependent upon local support for survival, provided him with unprecedented exposure to the conditions and concerns of common Scots, whose backing would prove essential for successful resistance against English occupation. This period of exile and hardship would prove formative in developing Bruce's later military innovations and his ability to inspire popular support that transcended traditional feudal relationships. The Western Highlands provided Bruce with temporary sanctuary due to the region's challenging geography and the limited effectiveness of English administrative control over territories that had historically operated with considerable independence from central authority. The complex network of sea locks, mountainous terrain and scattered islands created natural defensive positions that negated English advantages in heavy cavalry while providing numerous escape routes when English forces attempted to corner Scottish resistance groups. Local clan leaders, many of whom harboured grievances against English administrative policies, provided crucial support that enabled Bruce to maintain his resistance despite the loss of his traditional territorial base. Bruce's time in the islands brought him into contact with Highland military traditions that differed significantly from the feudal warfare practices that had dominated lowland Scotland, exposing him to guerrilla tactics and irregular warfare strategies that would prove essential for his later military success. Highland warriors possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain, combined with mobility and tactical flexibility that enabled effective operations against larger, more heavily equipped conventional forces. Their traditional emphasis on rapid movement, surprise attacks, and immediate withdrawal to secure positions provided Bruce with alternative military models that could be adapted to broader resistance campaigns throughout Scotland. The gradual expansion of Bruce's support base during 1307 reflected both his growing military effectiveness and the systematic English policies that had alienated increasing numbers of Scots who had initially accepted occupation as preferable to continued warfare. English administrative demands, including heavy taxation, forced labour for military projects, and arbitrary confiscation of property, had created widespread resentment that provided fertile ground for resistance recruitment. Bruce's ability to offer effective military leadership combined with his legitimate claims to royal authority attracted growing numbers of supporters who viewed his cause as offering genuine prospects for liberation from English oppression. The death of Edward I on July 7, 1307, while campaigning against Bruce in the Scottish borders, eliminated the English monarch whose personal commitment to Scottish conquest had driven the systematic policies of occupation and repression that had characterised the previous decade. Edward's death created immediate opportunities for Scottish resistance, as his son Edward II lacked both the military experience and the personal authority necessary to maintain the intensive pressure that his father had applied to Scottish independence movements. The new English king's immediate withdrawal from Scotland to secure his position in England provided Bruce with crucial breathing space to consolidate his support while developing the military capabilities necessary for sustained resistance. Edward II's character and priorities differed markedly from those of his father, as the new king showed greater interest in court politics and personal relationships than in the systematic military campaigns that had been his father's specialty. This shift in English royal priorities created opportunities for Scottish resistance that Bruce quickly moved to exploit, launching campaigns designed to recapture strategic positions while demonstrating Scottish military capabilities to potential supporters who had remained neutral during the initial phase of his rebellion. The reduced English military pressure enabled Bruce to transition from purely defensive guerrilla operations to more aggressive campaigns that could achieve tangible territorial gains. Bruce's military innovations during this period reflected his synthesis of Highland guerrilla tactics with conventional medieval warfare strategies, creating hybrid approaches that maximised Scottish advantages while minimising exposure to English strengths in heavy cavalry and siege warfare. His forces adopted practices of rapid movement between widely separated operational areas, making it impossible for English commanders to predict Scottish objectives while forcing English forces to disperse their strength across multiple potential targets. These tactics required exceptional coordination and communication capabilities that Bruce developed through careful selection and training of subordinate commanders who could operate independently while maintaining overall strategic coherence. The systematic campaign to recapture Scottish castles that began in 1307 demonstrated Bruce's understanding that effective resistance required control of fortified positions that could serve as secure bases for military operations, while denying English forces the strategic strongholds necessary for maintaining administrative control over Scottish territories. However, Bruce's approach to castle warfare differed significantly from traditional medieval siege practices, as his limited resources precluded the extended investments and elaborate siege engines typically employed in contemporary European warfare. Instead, Bruce developed innovative tactics that emphasized surprise, infiltration, and rapid assault techniques that could capture fortified positions without the prolonged campaigns that would expose Scottish forces to English counterattacks. The recapture of Turnberry Castle in February 1307 provided Bruce with his first significant territorial victory while demonstrating the effectiveness of his new military approaches. The operation involved coordinated attacks by land and sea forces that overwhelmed the English garrison before reinforcements could arrive, while the rapid consolidation of Scottish control prevented English attempts to recapture the position. The success provided Bruce with a secure base in his hereditary territories, while demonstrating to potential supporters that Scottish resistance could achieve concrete military objectives against English occupation forces. The capture of Loudon Hill in May 1307 marked Bruce's transition from guerrilla leader to conventional military commander, as his forces achieved decisive victory over a substantial English army commanded by Aymer de Valence, in circumstances that demonstrated Scottish ability to defeat English forces in direct confrontation when tactical conditions favoured Scottish capabilities. Bruce's selection of the battlefield revealed his growing tactical sophistication, as he chose terrain that channeled English cavalry charges into narrow fronts where Scottish infantry formations could effectively resist, while preventing English forces from exploiting their numerical superiority through extended battle lines. The tactical innovations employed at Loudon Hill reflected Bruce's adaptation of Highland warfare techniques to conventional battlefield conditions, as his forces used concealed positions and coordinated spear formations that maximised the effectiveness of Scottish infantry, while neutralising English cavalry advantages. The battle demonstrated that properly led Scottish forces could compete with English professional armies when commanders understood both Scottish capabilities and English vulnerabilities, providing crucial confidence for Scottish military development, while attracting additional supporters who recognised Bruce's growing effectiveness as a military leader. The death of Robert the Bruce on June 7, 1329, at Cardross Castle marked the end of an era that had witnessed Scotland's transformation from an occupied territory into a recognised independent kingdom. Yet his passing also initiated the most complex dynastic transition in Scottish medieval history. Bruce's only legitimate male heir, David, was barely 5 years old at the time of his father's death, creating a royal minority that would expose Scotland to renewed English aggression while testing the institutional foundations that the Bruce had established during his 23-year reign. The Regency government, dominated by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, faced immediate challenges that required both military preparedness to resist English territorial ambitions and diplomatic skill to maintain the international recognition of Scottish independence that Bruce had secured through decades of warfare and negotiation. The succession arrangements that Bruce had established before his death reflected his acute awareness of the vulnerabilities that royal minorities created for medieval kingdoms, particularly those facing hostile neighbours with superior military resources. The designation of Thomas Randolph as Guardian of Scotland provided the kingdom with experienced military leadership while ensuring continuity with the policies and personnel that had achieved Scottish independence. Randolph's extensive territorial holdings throughout northern Scotland, combined with his proven loyalty to the Bruce cause and his military expertise gained during the independence wars, positioned him to provide effective leadership during the critical early years of David II's reign. However, the complex genealogical relationships that connected the Bruce family to other Scottish noble houses created alternative claims to royal authority that would complicate the succession and ultimately lead to the establishment of the Stuart dynasty through an indirect female line. Robert the Bruce's daughter Marjorie had married Walter Stuart, the 6th High Steward of Scotland, before her tragic death in 1316, but not before giving birth to Robert Stuart, who possessed legitimate claims to the Scottish throne through his maternal grandfather. The infant Robert Stuart's position as heir presumptive to David II, should the young king die without male issue, established the Stuart family as crucial players in Scottish politics while creating potential sources of dynastic conflict that would influence Scottish affairs for generations. Walter Stuart's position as High Steward had made him one of the most powerful nobles in medieval Scotland, with responsibilities that encompassed royal household administration, military organisation, and territorial governance throughout western Scotland. The Stuart family's extensive landholdings in Renfrewshire, Ayrshire, and other regions provided them with substantial military resources and economic foundations that enabled them to play prominent roles in Scottish politics, regardless of their hereditary claims to royal succession. The family's consistent support for Scottish independence during the wars with England had established their credentials as reliable defenders of Scottish sovereignty, while creating personal relationships with other prominent Scottish families that would prove essential during future political crises. The immediate aftermath of Bruce's death witnessed renewed English efforts to exploit Scottish weakness during the royal minority, as Edward III of England moved quickly to support Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne while providing military assistance designed to restore English overlordship over Scotland. Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John Balliol, had spent decades in English exile cultivating support among English nobles and Scottish emigrants who had lost their positions during Bruce's reign. His claim to the Scottish throne possessed legal validity based on his father's recognition as king during the 1290s, while his willingness to acknowledge English overlordship made him an attractive alternative to David II from the English perspective. The invasion of Scotland by Edward Balliol and his supporters in August 1332 marked the beginning of what historians term the Second War of Scottish Independence. a conflict that would test the institutional foundations of Bruce's kingdom, while demonstrating the continuing fragility of Scottish independence in the face of sustained English pressure. Balliol's forces, supported by English military advisors and equipped with contemporary military technology, landed at Kinghorn in Fife and immediately began recruiting Scottish nobles who had grievances against the Bruce settlement or who calculated that English support offered better prospects for advancing their territorial ambitions. The Battle of Duplin Moor on August 11, 1332, resulted in catastrophic defeat for the Scottish forces led by Donald, Earl of Mar, demonstrating that the military innovations that had enabled Bruce's victories could be countered by opponents who understood Scottish tactical methods and possessed superior resources for sustained military campaigns. The engagement revealed fundamental weaknesses in Scottish military organisation during the royal minority, as competing noble authorities prevented effective coordination of resistance efforts, while personal rivalries undermined the unity that had characterised Scottish military efforts during Bruce's reign. The death of numerous Scottish nobles during the battle, including the Guardian Thomas Randolph's son, eliminated experienced military leadership while creating additional succession disputes that further fragmented Scottish resistance. Edward Balliol's coronation at Scone in September 1332 represented the temporary restoration of English overlordship over Scotland, yet his reign demonstrated the fundamental instability of any Scottish government that depended primarily upon English military support rather than genuine Scottish acceptance. Balliol's immediate acknowledgement of Edward III as his feudal overlord and his agreement to cede substantial Scottish territories to England reveal the extent to which his kingship served English rather than Scottish interests. The disinherited, as Balliol's Scottish supporters became known, represented primarily nobles who had lost lands during Bruce's reign and who viewed English support as their only means of recovering their former positions. The resistance to Balliol's rule began almost immediately, led by Scottish nobles who remained loyal to David II, and who recognised that Balliol's kingship threatened the independence that had been secured through decades of warfare and sacrifice. Archibald Douglas, younger brother of the famous James Douglas who had died carrying Bruce's heart to the Holy Land, emerged as the leader of Scottish resistance while serving as guardian during the continuing royal minority. Douglas's military campaigns employed the guerrilla tactics that had proven effective during the independence wars, avoiding direct confrontation with superior English forces while maintaining pressure on Balliol's supporters and preventing the consolidation of English administrative control. The complex military situation that developed during 1333 involved multiple competing authorities claiming legitimate control over different Scottish territories, creating conditions of civil war that devastated the Scottish economy while preventing effective resistance to English expansion. Edward III's personal involvement in Scottish affairs, including his siege of Berwick upon Tweed, demonstrated English determination to achieve permanent resolution of the Scottish problem through overwhelming military force combined with systematic destruction of Scottish resistance capabilities. The Siege of Berwick involved some of the most advanced military technology available in 14th century Europe, including sophisticated siege engines and coordinated naval operations that revealed English commitment to achieving decisive military victory. The Battle of Halidon Hill on July 19, 1333, represented the culmination of English military pressure against Scottish resistance, resulting in another devastating defeat that eliminated much of the Scottish military leadership while demonstrating English tactical superiority in conventional battlefield engagements. The battle occurred when Scottish forces attempted to relieve the English siege of Berwick, but English deployment of massed longbowmen supported by disciplined infantry formations created killing fields that Scottish cavalry and infantry could not penetrate. The systematic destruction of Scottish military formations revealed that English military innovations had neutralised the tactical advantages that had enabled Scottish success during the independence wars. The aftermath of Halidon Hill forced David II into French exile while leaving Scotland under effective English occupation. Yet the systematic brutality of English administrative policies gradually created conditions that would enable renewed Scottish resistance. Edward III's appointment of English administrators throughout Scotland, combined with policies that favoured English settlers over Scottish populations, generated widespread resentment that provided recruiting opportunities for resistance movements. The confiscation of Scottish lands for redistribution to English supporters eliminated the economic foundations that had enabled Scottish noble families to maintain their traditional positions, creating desperate circumstances that encouraged participation in resistance activities regardless of the military risks involved. The young David II's exile at the French court of Philip VI provided him with exposure to continental European governmental practices and military innovations, while ensuring his survival during the period of English occupation. The French alliance, originally established during Robert the Bruce's reign, proved crucial for maintaining Scottish independence claims, while providing diplomatic support that prevented international recognition of English conquest. French military assistance, including the provision of professional soldiers and advanced military equipment, would prove essential for the eventual restoration of Scottish independence, while French diplomatic pressure complicated English efforts to achieve international recognition of their Scottish conquests. The gradual recovery of Scottish resistance during the mid-1330s reflected both the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare tactics and the growing unpopularity of English occupation policies among Scottish populations who had initially accepted English rule as preferable to continued warfare. Scottish resistance leaders, including Robert Stewart and other nobles who had remained in Scotland, developed networks of support that extended throughout Scottish society while maintaining communication with David II's court in exile. These resistance networks employed traditional Highland tactics of rapid movement and surprise attacks while avoiding direct confrontation with superior English forces, gradually wearing down English administrative control while preparing for the eventual return of legitimate Scottish royal authority. The return of David II to Scotland in 1341 marked the beginning of a new phase in Scottish political development, as the 18-year-old king brought with him French military advisors and continental European governmental innovations, while possessing personal experience of exile that had strengthened his commitment to Scottish independence. David's early reign demonstrated remarkable military and diplomatic skill, as he successfully coordinated resistance activities throughout Scotland while maintaining the French alliance that provided essential international support. His military campaigns during the early 1340s systematically recaptured English-held positions while demonstrating Scottish ability to conduct sustained military operations against English occupation forces. However, David II's capture at the Battle of Neville's Cross in October 1346 created another extended period of royal absence that would prove formative for the development of Stuart power and influence within Scottish politics. The battle occurred when David led a Scottish invasion of northern England, designed to support French military objectives during the 100 Years' War. But English forces commanded by experienced military leaders achieved decisive victory that eliminated much of the Scottish military leadership while capturing the Scottish king himself. David's 11-year captivity in England would create unprecedented opportunities for Robert Stewart to establish his position as effective ruler of Scotland, while developing the political and administrative skills that would enable his eventual succession to the throne. Robert Stewart's regency during David II's captivity demonstrated remarkable political acumen and administrative capability, as he successfully maintained Scottish independence while managing the complex diplomatic negotiations necessary to secure the king's eventual release. Stewart's approach to governance emphasised cooperation with existing Scottish institutions, rather than revolutionary change, building support among Scottish nobles through careful distribution of patronage and territorial grants, while maintaining the military preparedness necessary to resist English territorial ambitions. His success in preserving Scottish independence during this critical period established his credentials as an effective ruler, while strengthening his position as heir presumptive to the childless David II. The development of distinctly Scottish cultural institutions during this period reflected both the kingdom's growing confidence in its independence and the influence of continental European cultural developments that Scottish nobles had encountered through military service and diplomatic missions. The establishment of Scotland's first university at St Andrews in 1413 represented a crucial milestone in Scottish intellectual development, providing the kingdom with indigenous educational capabilities that reduced dependence upon English and continental European institutions, while creating opportunities for Scottish scholars to contribute to broader European intellectual developments. The university's foundation reflected papal recognition of Scottish independence, while demonstrating Scottish commitment to participating in the broader European scholarly community. The University of St Andrews was established through the efforts of Henry Wardlaw, Bishop of St Andrews, whose extensive continental European connections enabled him to secure papal approval while recruiting distinguished scholars who could provide the university with immediate academic credibility. The institution's curriculum reflected contemporary European educational practices, while incorporating elements specifically designed to serve Scottish governmental and ecclesiastical needs. The university's emphasis on theology, law and liberal arts provided Scottish students with educational opportunities that had previously required expensive and dangerous travel to foreign institutions, while creating a trained administrative class that could serve Scottish governmental needs. The flourishing of Scottish literature during the late 14th and early 15th centuries reflected both the kingdom's political stability and the cultural confidence that accompanied successful resistance to English domination. John Barbour's epic poem The Bruce, completed around 1375, provided Scottish audiences with a heroic narrative of their recent struggle for independence, while establishing literary precedents that would influence Scottish cultural development for centuries. The poem's sophisticated use of vernacular Scots, rather than Latin or French, demonstrated growing confidence in indigenous Scottish cultural expression while making heroic literature accessible to broader Scottish audiences who lacked classical education. The development of Scottish vernacular poetry during this period involved systematic adaptation of continental European literary forms to Scottish themes and linguistic patterns, creating distinctive cultural products that reflected both Scottish political experiences and broader European literary influences. Scottish poets, including Robert Henryson and William Dunbar, developed sophisticated verse forms that combined traditional Celtic literary techniques with innovations borrowed from French and English poetry, creating works that demonstrated Scottish participation in broader European cultural developments while maintaining distinctive national characteristics. The architectural achievements of this period, including the construction of magnificent stone castles and religious buildings throughout Scotland, reflected both the kingdom's economic prosperity and the influence of continental European architectural developments on Scottish building practices. The reconstruction of major Scottish castles, according to the latest European military architectural principles, demonstrated Scottish ability to adapt international innovations to local conditions while providing secure bases for royal administration and military operations. These construction projects required coordination of skilled craftsmen, imported materials, and substantial financial resources that testified to Scotland's economic recovery following the devastation of the independence wars. The internal dynastic struggles that characterised the later Stuart period reflected both the success of the dynasty in establishing its legitimacy and the complex succession arrangements that had developed during the transition from Bruce to Stuart rule. Robert II's accession in 1371 following David II's death, without legitimate heirs, represented the peaceful transfer of power between dynasties, yet the new king's advanced age and the large number of his legitimate and illegitimate children created potential sources of future succession disputes. The systematic legitimization of Robert II's children through papal dispensation resolved immediate legal complications while establishing multiple lines of Stuart descent that would influence Scottish politics for generations. Robert II's reign demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Stuart governance, as his extensive family connections provided the dynasty with broad support throughout Scottish society, while creating competing claims to royal authority that would complicate future successions. The king's relatively passive approach to governance, reflecting both his advanced age at accession and his preference for delegating authority to capable subordinates, established precedents for Stuart kingship that emphasised cooperation with noble elites rather than the more assertive royal authority that had characterised previous Scottish monarchs. The problematic reign of Robert III, who succeeded his father in 1390, revealed the continuing challenges that faced Scottish royal authority despite the dynasty's successful establishment. Robert III's physical disabilities, resulting from injuries sustained before his accession, limited his ability to provide effective personal leadership, while creating opportunities for competing noble factions to pursue independent policies that undermined royal authority. The king's reliance upon his brother Robert, Duke of Albany, for governmental administration created a virtual regency that would persist throughout much of the reign, while establishing Albany as a major power in Scottish politics. The complex relationship between Robert III and the Duke of Albany reflected broader tensions within Scottish noble society regarding the appropriate balance between royal authority and noble independence that had developed during the extended periods of royal minority and absence that had characterised Scottish politics since David II's accession. Albany's extensive territorial holdings and administrative experience positioned him as the most powerful noble in Scotland, yet his ambitions for expanded authority created conflicts with royal prerogatives that would influence Scottish politics throughout the early 15th century. The Duke's effective control over royal governmental machinery enabled him to pursue policies that served his family's interests while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to legitimate royal authority. The capture and probable murder of David Stuart, Duke of Rothesay and heir to the throne, in 1402 represented the culmination of the power struggle between Robert III and the Duke of Albany, while creating succession arrangements that would bring James Stuart, the king's youngest son, to the throne under circumstances that would define his entire reign. Rothesay's death, officially attributed to illness but widely suspected to result from Albany's machinations, eliminated the most direct threat to Albany's continued dominance, while creating opportunities for the Duke to extend his influence over the eventual succession. The circumstances surrounding Rothesay's death reveal the extent to which personal rivalries and territorial ambitions had corrupted Scottish governmental processes while demonstrating the continuing fragility of royal authority, despite the Stuart dynasty's apparent consolidation of power. James's capture by English pirates in 1406 while travelling to France for his education created the most extended period of royal absence in Scottish history, as the 12-year-old prince would remain in English captivity for 18 years while Scotland was governed by regents whose authority derived from necessity rather than legitimate royal appointment. The Duke of Albany's assumption of the regency provided him with unprecedented opportunities to consolidate his family's power, while pursuing policies that served his territorial ambitions rather than broader Scottish interests. Albany's long regency demonstrated both his administrative capabilities and his willingness to subordinate royal interests to his family's advancement, creating precedents for noble independence that would complicate future efforts to restore effective royal authority. The impact of James I's extended captivity on Scottish governmental development proved profound and lasting, as the absence of legitimate royal authority encouraged the development of alternative power structures that operated independently of traditional monarchical control. Scottish noble families developed increasingly autonomous territorial administrations, while maintaining only nominal acknowledgement of royal authority, creating conditions that resemble the fragmentation that had characterised earlier periods of Scottish political development. The Regency government's inability to prevent these developments reflected both the inherent limitations of delegated authority and the specific weaknesses created by Albany's prioritisation of his family's interests over broader governmental effectiveness. The diplomatic implications of James III's captivity extended far beyond immediate governmental challenges to encompass fundamental questions about Scotland's international relationships and its ability to maintain the independence that had been secured through previous generations of warfare and sacrifice. English control over the Scottish king provided England with unprecedented leverage in Scottish affairs, while complicating Scottish efforts to maintain the French alliance that had proven essential for resisting English territorial ambitions. The ransom negotiations that dominated Anglo-Scottish diplomacy during James's captivity revealed the extent to which English policy sought to exploit Scottish weakness while avoiding the military commitments that would be required for renewed conquest attempts. James's return from English captivity in 1424 had initiated a period of aggressive royal centralisation that fundamentally altered the relationship between the Scottish crown and its nobility, yet his assassination in 1437 at Blackfriars Monastery in Perth demonstrated the violent resistance that such policies could provoke among nobles whose traditional autonomy had been systematically curtailed. The conspiracy that ended James's life involved some of Scotland's most prominent noble families, including Walter Stewart, Earl of Atholl, whose own claims to the throne provided additional motivation for eliminating a king whose authoritarian methods had alienated much of the Scottish political establishment. The brutal circumstances of the king's death, cornered in the monastery's sewer system, where he had sought refuge from his assassins, reflected both the personal hatred that James's policies had generated and the collapse of the reverence for royal authority that had traditionally protected Scottish monarchs even during periods of political conflict. The accession of 6-year-old James II in 1437 created another extended royal minority that would test the institutional foundations of Scottish monarchy, while providing opportunities for noble families to reassert the independence that James I had systematically undermined. The regency arrangements established following the young king's coronation reflected the complex balance of power that had emerged from the previous reign's conflicts, with competing noble factions manoeuvring to control royal policy while avoiding the open confrontation that had characterised the final years of James I's rule. Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas, emerged as the dominant figure in the new Regency government, leveraging his family's extensive territorial holdings and military resources to establish effective control over royal administration while maintaining the appearance of legitimate governmental authority. The Douglas family's ascendancy during James II's minority represented the culmination of a century-long process of territorial accumulation and political manoeuvring that had made them the most powerful noble house in Scotland outside the royal family itself. Their lands stretched across the Scottish borders and into the central lowlands, encompassing some of the kingdom's most fertile agricultural regions and strategically important fortified positions. The family's military reputation, established during the independence wars and maintained through subsequent generations of service to the Scottish crown, provided them with both the resources and the legitimacy necessary to dominate Scottish politics during periods of royal weakness. However, the Douglas dominance also represented a fundamental threat to royal authority that would require systematic dismantling once James II achieved his majority and began asserting personal control over governmental affairs. The concentration of military power and territorial resources in the hands of a single noble family created conditions that resembled the fragmentation of royal authority that had characterised earlier periods of Scottish political development, while the Douglases' extensive international connections, particularly with England and France, enabled them to pursue independent diplomatic policies that could compromise Scottish sovereignty. The family's control over key border fortresses provided them with the capability to negotiate independently with English authorities, while their French connections offered alternative sources of military support that could challenge royal authority. James II's personal assumption of royal authority in 1449 marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to restore royal supremacy through policies that combined careful political manoeuvring with decisive military action designed to eliminate the Douglas threat permanently. The young king's approach differed significantly from his father's confrontational methods, as James II demonstrated remarkable political sophistication in isolating the Douglases from potential allies while building coalitions of support among other noble families who viewed Douglas dominance as threatening to their own interests. This strategy required careful attention to the complex web of kinship relationships, territorial disputes, and personal grievances that connected Scottish noble families, while maintaining the delicate balance between royal authority and noble autonomy that had proven so difficult for previous Scottish monarchs. The king's marriage to Mary of Guelders in 1449 provided crucial international legitimacy for his anti-Douglas policies, while securing access to continental European military technology and expertise that would prove essential for the systematic reduction of Douglas strongholds. Mary's connections to the Burgundian court, one of the most sophisticated political and cultural centres in 15th century Europe, brought Scottish royal administration into contact with advanced governmental techniques and military innovations that enhanced royal capabilities while demonstrating Scotland's emergence as a significant European power. The Queen's substantial dowry provided financial resources that enabled James II to maintain professional military forces and conduct extended siege operations against fortified positions that had previously been considered impregnable. The systematic campaign against Douglas power began with careful legal manoeuvring designed to isolate individual family members while avoiding direct confrontation with the full Douglas military coalition. James II employed sophisticated legal arguments to challenge Douglas territorial claims and administrative appointments, using royal courts and ecclesiastical authorities to undermine Douglas legitimacy, while building cases for the forfeiture of specific properties and offices. These legal proceedings demonstrated the king's understanding that successful elimination of Douglas power required both military victory and legal justification that would prevent future challenges to royal actions while establishing precedents for royal authority over noble territorial holdings. The dramatic confrontation at Stirling Castle in February 1452, when James II personally stabbed William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas, during a royal dinner, represented the culmination of months of escalating tension between the Crown and the Douglas family, while demonstrating the king's willingness to employ extreme measures to eliminate threats to royal authority. The circumstances surrounding Douglas's death revealed James II's careful preparation for this decisive moment, as the king had assembled sufficient military forces to deal with immediate Douglas retaliation, while ensuring that other noble families would support royal actions rather than rallying to Douglas support. The killing occurred during discussions about Douglas's refusal to abandon his alliance with the Earl of Crawford and other nobles who had formed a confederation that challenged royal authority, with James demanding that Douglas dissolve these relationships as a condition for continued royal favour. The immediate aftermath of Douglas's murder demonstrated James II's political maturity and military preparedness, as royal forces moved quickly to secure strategic positions throughout Douglas territory, while preventing coordinated retaliation from Douglas supporters. The king's brothers, James Douglas, 9th Earl of Douglas, and Archibald Douglas, Earl of Moray, initially attempted to organise resistance to royal actions, but their efforts were undermined by the systematic political preparation that had preceded the Stirling incident. Many potential Douglas allies had been neutralised through royal grants and political agreements, while others calculated that supporting the crown offered better prospects for advancing their own territorial ambitions. than continuing loyalty to a family whose power was clearly waning. The siege and destruction of Douglas strongholds throughout 1452 and 1453 employed the most advanced military technology available in 15th century Europe, including massive siege cannons that could breach stone fortifications that had previously been considered impregnable. James II's personal fascination with artillery technology led him to import cannon founders from continental Europe while establishing Scottish foundries that could produce the heavy guns necessary for systematic siege warfare. The king's collection of siege artillery, including the famous cannon Mons Meg, which still survives at Edinburgh Castle, represented one of the most advanced artillery trains in contemporary Europe, and provided Scottish royal forces with decisive advantages over traditional castle defences. The technical sophistication of James II's siege operations reflected broader European military innovations that were transforming the nature of warfare while making traditional feudal military arrangements increasingly obsolete. The massive stone walls that had protected medieval castles proved vulnerable to sustained bombardment from heavy cannons, while the enormous expense of maintaining effective artillery trains meant that only royal governments could afford the military technology necessary for successful siege warfare. These developments fundamentally altered the balance of power between royal authority and noble independence, as individual noble families could no longer maintain the military capabilities necessary to resist determined royal pressure. The systematic destruction of Douglas military power culminated in the Battle of Arkenholm in May 1455, where royal forces achieved decisive victory over the remaining Douglas coalition, while capturing or killing most of the family's military leadership. The engagement demonstrated the effectiveness of royal military reforms, as disciplined infantry formations supported by artillery achieved comprehensive victory over traditional feudal military forces that relied primarily on heavy cavalry and individual combat prowess. The battle's outcome eliminated the Douglas family as a significant political force, while providing other Scottish noble families with clear evidence of the consequences of challenging royal authority. The forfeiture of Douglas lands following their military defeat enabled James II to implement the most comprehensive redistribution of noble property in Scottish medieval history, creating opportunities to reward loyal supporters while establishing royal control over strategically important territories that had previously operated with virtual independence. The redistribution process revealed James II's sophisticated understanding of Scottish noble politics, as he carefully balanced competing claims and interests, while ensuring that no single family could accumulate the territorial resources necessary to challenge royal authority in the future. Former Douglas properties were divided among multiple recipients, with particular attention to preventing the concentration of border fortresses under single noble control that had enabled Douglas independence. The cultural and intellectual flowering that characterised James II's reign reflected both the political stability achieved through the elimination of Douglas opposition and the broader European Renaissance influences that reached Scotland through diplomatic and commercial connections. The king's patronage of arts and learning demonstrated Scottish royal participation in the cultural developments that were transforming European court life, while his support for educational institutions and scholarly activities enhanced Scotland's international reputation as a centre of learning and culture. The establishment of the University of Glasgow in 1451 provided Scotland with a second major educational institution, while demonstrating royal commitment to intellectual development that could serve both governmental and ecclesiastical needs. The architectural achievements of James II's reign, including major construction projects at royal residences throughout Scotland, reflected both the kingdom's economic prosperity and the influence of continental European architectural developments on Scottish building practices. The reconstruction of Stirling Castle according to the latest European residential architectural principles created a royal residence that could compete with contemporary European courts while providing secure facilities for royal administration and diplomatic activities. These construction projects required coordination of skilled craftsmen from throughout Europe, imported materials, and substantial financial resources that demonstrated Scotland's capacity to undertake major cultural projects while maintaining military preparedness. James II's tragic death in August 1460 during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, killed by the explosion of one of his own cannons, eliminated one of medieval Scotland's most effective monarchs at the height of his powers while creating another royal minority that would test the institutional foundations he had established. The circumstances of the king's death, occurring during a military campaign designed to recapture the last English-held fortress in Scotland, reflected his personal commitment to completing the territorial unification that had been a Scottish royal objective since the Independence Wars. The explosion that killed James II also eliminated several other prominent Scottish nobles, creating leadership gaps that complicated the succession arrangements while demonstrating the dangerous nature of contemporary military technology. The regency established for 8-year-old James III reflected lessons learned from previous royal minorities, as the arrangements emphasised collective leadership and institutional continuity rather than dependence upon individual noble authority that had created problems during earlier periods of royal weakness. Queen Mary of Guelders assumed a prominent role in the regency government, bringing continental European governmental experience while maintaining the international connections that had proven crucial for Scottish diplomatic and military success. The Regency's emphasis on continuing James II's policies, particularly regarding the systematic strengthening of royal authority and the completion of territorial unification, demonstrated institutional maturity that had been lacking during previous Scottish royal minorities. The capture of Roxburgh Castle in 1460, completed despite James II's death during the siege, marked the elimination of the last English territorial presence in Scotland, while demonstrating Scottish military capabilities that had been developed through decades of systematic royal investment in military technology and professional forces. The successful siege employed the artillery techniques that James II had pioneered, while the systematic destruction of the castle's fortifications ensured that it could never again serve as a base for English expansion into Scottish territory. The victory completed the territorial unification that had been a Scottish royal objective since the Independence Wars, while providing tangible evidence of Scottish military superiority over English forces. James III's personal assumption of royal authority in the early 1470s revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental system that had been developed during the previous century of Stuart rule. The king's intellectual interests and cultural sophistication reflected the Renaissance influences that were transforming European court culture, yet his preference for scholarly and artistic pursuits over the military and political activities that had characterised previous Scottish monarchs created tensions with noble expectations about royal leadership. James III's patronage of humanist scholars, musicians and artists demonstrated Scottish participation in broader European cultural developments, while enhancing the kingdom's international reputation as a centre of learning and artistic achievement. However, James III's apparent neglect of traditional royal responsibilities, particularly regarding military leadership and noble consultation, gradually alienated significant portions of the Scottish political establishment while creating opportunities for noble opposition that would ultimately prove fatal to his reign. The king's preference for low-born advisers with scholarly and artistic credentials over established noble councillors violated traditional expectations about royal consultation, while excluding powerful noble families from the governmental influence they considered their hereditary right. These policies created resentment that would eventually coalesce into organised opposition capable of challenging royal authority through military force. The complex international situation that developed during James III's reign reflected Scotland's emergence as a significant European power whose diplomatic relationships could influence broader European political developments. The king's marriage negotiations involving his siblings with European royal houses demonstrated Scottish equality with other European monarchies while creating diplomatic opportunities that enhanced Scottish security and international standing. The proposed marriage between James III's sister Margaret and the future Richard III of England represented a dramatic reversal of traditional Anglo-Scottish hostility, while negotiations involving Scottish royal marriages with French and Scandinavian nobility reflected the kingdom's integration into European diplomatic networks. The domestic opposition that emerged during the 1480s reflected both specific grievances against James III's governmental policies and broader noble resistance to the systematic strengthening of royal authority that had characterised Stuart rule since James VI's return from captivity. The conspiracy that culminated in the king's death at the Battle of Saxe-Burn in June 1488 involved some of Scotland's most prominent noble families, who justified their rebellion through claims that James III had violated traditional royal obligations while pursuing policies that threatened Scottish independence and noble rights. The rebels' use of the 15-year-old Prince James as a figurehead for their movement provided legal legitimacy while demonstrating their commitment to preserving monarchical institutions, even while eliminating an unacceptable monarch. James IV's accession in 1488 at age 15 marked the beginning of the most brilliant period in medieval Scottish history, as the young king combined the intellectual sophistication and cultural interests of his father with the military prowess and political acumen that Scottish nobles expected from their monarchs. James IV's early reign demonstrated remarkable maturity and political skill, as he successfully reconciled the noble factions that had supported and opposed his father, while implementing policies that strengthened royal authority without generating the systematic opposition that had characterised previous reigns. The king's ability to balance competing noble interests while maintaining royal prerogatives reflected both personal political talent and institutional developments that had matured during previous Stuart reigns. The cultural achievements of James IV's reign represented the culmination of Scottish Renaissance development, as royal patronage of arts, learning, and architecture created cultural institutions and artistic works that rivaled contemporary European achievements while maintaining distinctively Scottish characteristics. The king's court attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from throughout Europe, transforming Edinburgh into a cosmopolitan cultural centre that demonstrated Scottish participation in broader European intellectual developments. The establishment of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1505 reflected the king's interest in medical and scientific advancement, while providing Scotland with professional medical education that served both civilian and military needs. James IV's personal intellectual interests encompassed an extraordinary range of subjects including medicine, theology, languages, and natural philosophy, while his practical skills included surgery, dentistry, and various crafts that demonstrated his commitment to hands-on learning and experimentation. Contemporary accounts describe the king performing dental procedures and surgical operations, while his patronage of alchemical experiments and mechanical innovations reflected Renaissance interests in empirical investigation and technological development. The king's linguistic abilities, which included fluency in Latin, French, Spanish, and several other languages, enabled him to participate personally in diplomatic negotiations while demonstrating Scottish cultural sophistication to foreign ambassadors. The architectural projects undertaken during James IV's reign, including major construction at Holyrood Palace, Stirling Castle, and other royal residences, reflected both the kingdom's economic prosperity and the influence of continental European architectural developments on Scottish building practices. The Great Hall at Stirling Castle, completed during James IV's reign, represented one of the finest examples of late medieval royal architecture in Europe. With sophisticated stone carving, elaborate timberwork, and innovative heating systems that demonstrated Scottish mastery of contemporary building techniques. These construction projects required coordination of skilled craftsmen from throughout Europe while showcasing Scottish wealth and cultural sophistication to foreign visitors. The complex diplomatic relationships that James IV maintained with European powers reflected Scotland's emergence as a significant player in European politics, whose alliances were actively sought by major powers competing for advantage in the complex international situation that characterised early 16th century Europe. The king's marriage to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, in 1503 represented a dramatic shift in Anglo-Scottish relations, while demonstrating Scottish equality with other European royal houses through this prestigious marriage alliance. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the royal wedding, which attracted representatives from throughout Europe, provided Scotland with unprecedented international visibility, while showcasing the kingdom's wealth and cultural sophistication. However, the fundamental tensions between Scotland's traditional French alliance and the new English connection created diplomatic complications that would ultimately prove irreconcilable when broader European conflicts forced Scotland to choose between competing loyalties. The League of Cambrai and subsequent European alliance systems placed Scotland in the difficult position of maintaining relationships with powers that were increasingly committed to military confrontation, while Scottish national interests required policies that could preserve the kingdom's independence regardless of the outcome of broader European conflicts. James IV's attempts to balance these competing obligations demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill, yet the fundamental incompatibility of Scottish commitments would ultimately force the kingdom into military confrontation that would end the medieval period of Scottish history. The military preparations that characterised the later years of James IV's reign reflected both the king's personal interest in military technology and his recognition that Scotland's international commitments might require military action to maintain the kingdom's credibility as a reliable ally. The development of Scottish artillery capabilities, building upon the foundations established by James II, created one of the most advanced military forces in contemporary Europe while demonstrating Scottish technological sophistication. The king's personal involvement in military training and weapons development reflected Renaissance ideals about royal leadership while ensuring that Scottish forces possessed the capabilities necessary for successful military operations against contemporary European armies. The invasion of England in August 1513, undertaken in response to French requests for Scottish military assistance against the English invasion of France, represented James IV's commitment to honouring Scottish alliance obligations despite the personal risks involved in confronting English forces that possessed significant advantages in numbers and resources. The Scottish army that crossed the border represented the largest and best equipped military force in Scottish history, with advanced artillery, professional infantry formations, and noble cavalry that reflected decades of military development and substantial financial investment. The campaign's initial success, including the capture of several English border fortresses, demonstrated Scottish military capabilities while fulfilling Scottish obligations to provide meaningful assistance to French allies. The Battle of Flodden on September 9, 1513, represented both the culmination of medieval Scottish military development and the tragic end of the most successful period in Scottish medieval history. James IV's decision to accept battle against the English army commanded by the Earl of Surrey reflected his confidence in Scottish military capabilities and his commitment to decisive action that could achieve strategic objectives rather than the limited raids that had characterised previous Anglo-Scottish warfare. The Scottish deployment on Flodden Hill initially provided tactical advantages that enabled Scottish artillery to inflict significant casualties on English forces while demonstrating the effectiveness of Scottish military innovations. However, the tactical developments during the battle revealed fundamental weaknesses in Scottish military organisation that proved fatal despite the army's technological sophistication and numerical strength. The Scottish advance from their defensive positions on Flodden Hill exposed them to English tactical innovations, including the effective use of bill-armed infantry formations that proved superior to Scottish pike formations in close combat. The death of James IV during the final phase of the battle, fighting in the front ranks alongside his nobles, rather than maintaining the protected command position that contemporary military practice recommended, eliminated Scottish military leadership at the crucial moment when coordinated command might have enabled tactical recovery. The catastrophic Scottish casualties at Flodden, including the king, numerous earls, bishops, and thousands of ordinary soldiers, represented the most devastating military defeat in Scottish history, while eliminating much of the political and military leadership that had enabled Scottish success during the previous century. The battle's outcome demonstrated that Scottish military innovations, while impressive, remained insufficient to overcome English advantages in numbers and tactical organisation when circumstances forced Scotland to fight under conditions that favoured English capabilities. The death of so many prominent Scottish nobles created succession crises throughout the kingdom while eliminating the experienced leadership necessary for effective governance during the royal minority that would inevitably follow James IV's death. The immediate aftermath of Flodden marked the effective end of medieval Scotland, as the kingdom faced challenges that required adaptation to early modern political and military realities, while dealing with the leadership vacuum created by the battle's unprecedented casualties. The accession of 70-month-old James V created the longest and most challenging royal minority in Scottish history, while the systematic destruction of Scottish military capabilities at Flodden eliminated the kingdom's ability to resist English pressure through traditional military means. The regency arrangements established following James IV's death reflected the limited options available to surviving Scottish leaders, while the broader European political situation offered fewer opportunities for the diplomatic manoeuvring that had enabled previous Scottish recoveries from military disasters. The transformation of Scotland from a medieval kingdom into an early modern state would require fundamental changes in governmental organisation, military technology, and international relationships that built upon the foundations established during the medieval period while adapting to new political and military realities. The Stuart dynasty's survival of the Flodden catastrophe and their eventual success in maintaining Scottish independence during the challenging circumstances of the 16th century testify to the institutional strength that had been developed during the medieval period, while the cultural and intellectual achievements of the Renaissance monarchy provided foundations for continued Scottish participation in European civilization, despite the political and military challenges that lay ahead. Thus ended the medieval period of Scottish history, not with conquest or political collapse, but with a military catastrophe that eliminated an entire generation of Scottish leadership, while demonstrating both the achievements and limitations of medieval Scottish civilization. The kingdom that James IV had led to destruction at Flodden represented the culmination of 5 centuries of political development that had transformed Scotland from a collection of competing tribal territories into a unified European power, capable of influencing continental politics while maintaining its distinctive national identity. The tragic conclusion of this medieval achievement at Flodden would require Scottish survivors to develop new approaches to governance, warfare, and diplomacy that would enable the kingdom's survival and eventual prosperity during the early modern period that was about to begin.